Okay. Okay, the meeting is now resumed in public session. Before we begin, can I amend members, witnesses and those in the public gallery to make sure the mobile phones are completely turned off, please, as they interfere with the broadcasting system here in the committee room. I'd like to welcome from the Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine. We're here today, first of all, to discuss TB eradication programme. I'd like to welcome from the Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine Mr Michael Sheenan, Deputy Chief Veterinary Officer, Mr Owen Ryan, Senior Supervisor Veterinary Inspector, Mr Colin Ford, Principal Officer, Mr Ron Green, Assistant Principal, and Mr Philip Breslin, Senior Veterinary Inspector, and thank them for coming before the committee today to bring the committee up to date on the TB eradication programme. Before we begin, I must bring your attention to the issue of privilege. Witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect to the evidence you are given to the committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter, and you continue to do so, you are entitled thereafter to qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that where possible you should not criticise or make charges against any person or entity by name in such ways to make him or her identifiable. Members are reminded of long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that members should not comment on, criticise or make charge against either person outside the House or an official by name, or in such ways to make him or her identifiable. Mr Sheenan, I will ask you to make your opening statement, please, when you are ready.
Okay. Thank you, Chairman. And just briefly, you've mentioned the names. So on the right here is my colleague Colin Ford, who's the head of the division that looks after policy and administration of the scheme. And on my extreme left here is his colleague Roseanne Green. And then on either side of me here, on my right, is Owen Ryan, who's the equivalent of Principal Officer in charge of the veterinary and technical side of things, and his colleague Philip Breslin. So first of all, thanks to the committee for giving us the opportunity to update you on developments with the bovine TB scheme. I'm sure everybody who comes in here probably says thanks to the committee for giving them the opportunity, but I think in this case we actually mean it. You know, we think we've quite a good story to tell in relation to progress on TB. So we started off by just giving people a very brief history of where we've come from, and I think it's important to put things in context. So as you'll be aware, we've had a programme in operation since the 50s. And because TB is a zoonosis, in other words, a disease of animals that can be transmitted to people, the initial focus on dealing with TB in cattle was driven in large part by efforts to reduce TB in the human population. And again, as many of us will know from family and so on, at one stage TB was a huge scourge in the human population. It was commonly known as consumption or galloping consumption. And just a few figures, at one stage it was estimated about 12,000 people a year were dying from TB in Ireland back in the 1900s. And right through the 20s, 30s and 40s, TB remained a very, very serious and significant disease of people. So the efforts to eradicate TB when they started in the 50s were largely coincided with the efforts to deal with TB in the human population. And again, from some of the figures I've given you here, as you can see, not only was TB a huge issue in the human population back in the 20s, 30s and 40s and 50s, it was a very, very significant disease in the cattle population. And it's hard to believe at this stage, but about 17% of all cattle back in when we started the scheme in the 50s actually had TB. So, and many cattle at that stage actually had the actual disease, the actual clinical signs of TB, which TB mastitis and carcass condemnations and so on were very common. So, as I said, it coincided with the efforts to eradicate TB, coincided with the efforts to deal with TB in the human population. And again, just to remind ourselves, we're in the lucky position in Ireland now that TB in people is not a significant issue. The number of cases every year are relatively very low, but globally TB in humans is still a very, very significant disease, and it's estimated about 9 million people a year develop TB and about 1.5 million people die from TB. So then moving on, in addition to looking for reasons why we have a TB eradication programme, in addition to the human health benefits to controlling TB in cattle, a TB eradication programme is essential to facilitate trade in cattle and in animal products. So having a programme in place, it's actually a requirement of EU trade law. And again, as everyone will know in this committee, as a country that exports over 90% of our agricultural products, complying with trade law is essential in supporting the incomes of Irish farm families. And again, just to mention, outside of EU law and having a TB programme, increasingly with Brexit, our focus turns to third country markets, and increasingly we find in our dealings with third country markets, TB is an issue that they focus on. And so, for example, just to give the example recently of our opening up of the Chinese market to beef, one of the stipulations in relation to the certification of beef to China relates to TB and the TB status of herd. So, again, for all those reasons, having a good TB eradication programme in place is very important. So we gave you some graphs there. So figure 1 gives an indication as to the scale of the progress that has been made in reducing TB levels since the start of the programme. So as we mentioned, at the very early stages of the disease eradication programme, we were dealing with very, very high levels of TB in the population. You know, in the early 60s, we were talking about 150,000 reactors a year being removed on an annual basis. So then, briefly, you know, we made very good progress in the early years, and then in the 80s and 90s, progress stalled to a significant extent, and we were bumping along at 30 to 40,000 reactors a year. And there was lots of debate as to why that was and what was causing the lack of further progress. And over time, it became evident that the significant factor that was stymieing any further progress was the wildlife reservoir, which it became apparent that the reservoir, namely the badger population, that was the significant factor that we hadn't been aware of prior to this, and the scientific evidence became stronger and stronger that was the significant factor. So to deal with that, then we put a wildlife programme in place in the late 1990s, focusing initially on culling of badgers, and since that programme was established in the late 1990s, again we've begun to make further significant progress in relation to TB eradication. So, as I said, it's provided a significant boost to our efforts to eradicate TB, and there's some figures I'll mention again in a little while. And again, just to mention in relation to badgers, it's not a simple process because badgers are a protected species under the Berne Convention, so there are strict controls in place to ensure the sustainability of the native badger population. And so when we put a culling programme in place in an area, you know, we have to do an epidemiological assessment carried out by our veterinary inspectorate, and then a licence is issued by Parks and Wildlife, which limits the amount of culling that can take place to, you know, nationally to about 30% of the agricultural land of Ireland. So there are limits in place on what we can do in relation to culling of badgers, and we have to comply with those strict conditions. So while these measures are important to protect the badger, it has been argued that it poses challenges in eradicating bovine TB. However, I suppose there have been some further developments in that in recent years. So after lots of research, a BCG vaccine being the same TB vaccine that's used in people we all got as children. So lots of research went into looking at whether BCG vaccine could be used in badgers, and our research has shown that it can, and quite successfully. So the research concluded that vaccinating badgers in an area is not inferior to culling badgers in an area. So in other words, vaccination is more or less as good as culling as a means to deal with TB transmission from badgers to cattle. So, I mean, this is a very positive development. It represents a fundamental shift in our ability to move on towards eradicating TB, because while we were previously limited to culling badgers on 30% of the land area, with vaccination there's no such restriction, so we will ultimately move to vaccinating in time over the entire country. So that's a significant development, and obviously from a badger point of view, it's a positive development as well. So we've done modelling work in conjunction with our colleagues in UCD, and so they have calculated that this additional tool of vaccination of badgers will allow us, over the longer period, it will allow us to actually think about final eradication of TB. So, as I mentioned, since we started our badger programme in the late 1990s, the number of reactors has declined from about 44,000 a year to our current level of 16,000 to 18,000 reactors per year. And the proportion of herds affected by TB has effectively halved in that time. So that's, again, further very significant progress. But we're now at the stage where that progress, again, if we're to make further progress, this is where we now need to add in some new additional measures to get us to the final finishing line in relation to eradication. So, and just to mention, our herd incidence levels, you know, are considerably lower than the situation in Northern Ireland, Wales and England. So, again, just to move on, while the badger programme, the wildlife programme, is important, it remains the case that the primary transmission route for TB is from cattle to cattle, and so our programme has extensive measures in place to address this cattle to cattle transmission. So again, you'll all be familiar with all this. Every herd in the country is required to have an annual skin test, and this is performed by the private vets, the PVPs, who have a crucial role to play in helping to achieve eradication. And thankfully, as I mentioned, over 96% of herds in Ireland will be clear, on any annual basis. When TB is identified in a herd, then our department's veterinary inspectorate will engage with the farmer in helping him or her to eradicate TB from the herd in the shortest time possible. Another diagnostic tool that you probably will have heard mention of in recent years is we now have a blood test available called the gamma interferon test, and that's another additional useful tool that can help us in herds where we've already identified infection. It enables us to pick up at a slightly earlier stage of development animals that are likely to be harbouring TB. So it's another useful additional tool. It's not a silver bullet, but it is another useful additional tool. So we do other risk-based testing under the programme. For example, if a herd has a breakdown with a certain number of reactor animals, a contiguous programme is established. In other words, a programme of testing takes place in the neighbouring herds. And that's another important element of the programme. Research is something I suppose we spend a lot of energy and a lot of money on in recent years. So it's a key. It provides the key evidence that informs any policy decisions we make in relation to the TB programme. And just last week, on Friday of last week, we brought together all of the TB research community in Ireland and Northern Ireland and the UK as well. So this work obviously helps enhance our understanding of the epidemiology of TB and how we can most effectively eradicate it. Then again, as people here will be aware, Minister Creed has committed to eradicate TB by 2030 from Ireland. And when achieved, this will represent a major success for Irish agriculture and particularly for Irish farmers. However, it will only be possible if the current eradication programme is enhanced and all stakeholders support the programme. An important point is that international experience from Australia and New Zealand, for example, have highlighted the benefits that accrue when the public and private sectors collaborate in efforts to eradicate disease. So in other words, I suppose our point is that the Department of Agriculture alone is not going to eradicate TB. It needs the support of all the stakeholders if we're to actually get to final eradication. And that's been the experience in countries like Australia and New Zealand who have achieved eradication. So with this in mind, Minister Creed received government approval, a memo went to Cabinet in May to establish a TB stakeholder forum with an independent chairman. And the mandate of the TB Forum is to develop evidence-informed policies that can eradicate TB by 2030 while respecting the principles that were outlined in the National Farmed Animal Health Strategy. So this is a strategy that was launched the year before, which has 4 sort of overarching principles: working in partnership, acknowledging roles and responsibilities, reflecting costs and benefits, and prevention is better than cure. So that sort of overarching policy, it guides everything we do on the animal health front at the moment, and TB being no different than that. So in order to inform the TB Forum's deliberations, the Department published 3 consultation papers. These were on our website, and to focus on the principles in relation to governance, policy options and costs and benefits. So the Forum has been meeting. Its first meeting of the Forum took place in September, and there have been monthly meetings of the main Forum since then, as well as sort of side meetings with the various stakeholders in separate sessions. And to date, discussions have focused on governance and policy options. Costs and benefits are scheduled to be discussed at the next Forum meeting in January. And the plan is that the Forum will conclude its deliberations in the first half of next year, possibly March or April. And after that, then the Forum will make recommendations to the Minister on various policy options. So we in the Department are convinced that eradication by 2030 is achievable, and we will continue to engage with all stakeholders in realising this ambition. So just to summarise where we are now and what we see as the important next steps. So just to make the point again, bovine TB levels over the last 3 years are lower than they ever have been since the programme started in the 1950s, with fewer farmers affected by the financial burden and the emotional stress of having their herd locked up with disease. And figure 3, which in the paper I provided, highlights that in many areas of the country, there's already very, very low levels of TB. So it's not a universal picture. It's not that TB is evenly spread around the country. There are significant parts along the west coast, for example, parts of Donegal, parts of Mayo, parts of Galway, significant parts of counties Waterford, significant parts of Limerick, and so on, that already have very, very low levels of TB. So it's not a universal picture. So. While the current programme has been very effective in driving levels down, the science tells us that the current programme will not be enough to eradicate TB in the short or medium term. Just to clarify that, with what we're doing at the moment, and with the addition of vaccination of badgers being spread across the country over the next number of years, the science, the models tell us that over a long period of time, that will eventually lead to eradication of TB. So if we keep doing what we're doing at the moment and maybe do things a bit better and a bit quicker and add in vaccination of badgers, we will, in 30 to 40 years' time, we will get to the finishing line. But obviously we would think that we can do better than that with the addition of some additional measures, and that's what we're talking to the stakeholders in the forum on, what those additional measures might be. So to protect cattle from the disease and to protect farmers and farm families from the burden of a breakdown, we need to continue to do what we're doing, but we also need to do more as well. So again, that's a point I suppose we'll keep making. So we have funded very substantial research into TB in Ireland since the 1990s, and we will continue to do so. And this research is providing us with the evidence base which underlines our policy and which helps us to identify areas where our policies do not sufficiently address the disease risks. So we now know, we have a good idea now what needs to be done in broad terms to lower the level of bovine TB further and to achieve eradication in the shortest time possible. We need to further reduce cattle-to-cattle transmission of the disease. We need to maintain effective controls on badger-to-cattle transmission of disease. We need to do more to eliminate infection from chronically infected herds. And we need to do more to protect the almost 97% of herds which do not have TB. So, as I mentioned already, it's clear the Department can't do this alone, and we've mentioned international experience has shown us that without the support of stakeholders, we won't achieve what we'd like to achieve, certainly not by 2030. So it's not always a simple matter to achieve agreement and buy-in from the various stakeholder groups on these matters, so TB eradication will involve some difficult choices. Nevertheless, continuing with our current course, while sufficient to keep TB at current levels, it again just will not be enough to reduce the disease levels further, so we will need to do more. So, as part of more efforts to engage with stakeholders, apart from the meetings of the forum and the meeting with the farm bodies and the meetings with Ireland and Dairy Industry Ireland, etc., we've also spoken recently, my colleagues and I, at 7 public meetings over the last couple of months, where we had in total about 1,000 farmers in attendance, most of whom had been affected by TB in their herds in recent times. We've also spoken to various farm organisations, both at national and local level in recent times, and at knowledge transfer events and so on, and we're happy to continue to do so. So we'll be shortly launching an improved communication campaign involving leaflets, videos on YouTube, frequently asked questions on our website and so on, to address some of the common concerns farmers have about the TB eradication scheme, the TB tests, and what can farmers actually do to reduce the risks of TB to their cattle through their own choices. In relation to communications, I suppose what we found is that even though we've been at TB eradication for a long time, what we found is that, and even though farmers have a test every year, often it's surprising when it comes to the detail of what the test involves and what the blood test involves and what happens when the cattle, the reactors, go to the factory. We were surprised to find that actually, in fact, often farmers didn't have proper information about what was happening and what was involved in the test and why their reactors didn't have lesions in the factory and what that meant. So we've been putting a lot of work into trying to actually give better information out to farmers about what's involved in the whole programme. And even when it came to vets, PVPs who were involved in TB testing, in some cases we found they didn't have as much information about the nitty-gritty of what the blood tests involve and so on. So we put focus on that in recent times as well. So we think it's important to communicate to farmers as well that there are things that they can do, that there are things that can increase the risk of TB in their herd, and conversely there are things that they can do to decrease the risk of them getting TB in their herd. So farmers are not entirely powerless in this situation. So that's something we need to do some work on to actually better educate farmers and to empower themselves in relation to certain decisions they're making on their farm about what they can and do to increase or preferably decrease their risk. So, for example, herds which have had a TB breakdown are at increased risk of a further breakdown for up to 10 years. So there's put a graph in there. So in other words, the risk, if you've had TB in your herd, the risk does not disappear once that herd goes clear, and that's important when it comes to decision making about buying and selling cattle and so on. So there are things that farmers in that situation can do to reduce that risk, and we want to support farmers in making choices, giving them the information and letting them make the choices which protect their cattle and thereby protect themselves and their families from the stress and burden of TB. So just in conclusion, working together with stakeholders, we're confident we can eradicate TB by 2030, but to do so will require some decisions which may be difficult for some in the short term, but which will yield very significant long-term benefits for all. So thank you for your attention, and we'll be happy to try and answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sheehan, for a very informative presentation. First of all, before I bring in members of the committee, just a couple of questions myself. First of all, I know in your presentation you never mentioned the deer. And to a lot of people, first of all, I suppose it's every farmer's worst nightmare to have the situation arrive at your farm when you're told that you have a reactor or reactors, unfortunately. But some people would argue in certain parts of the country, deer is a major contributory factor to TB. You don't mention it in your presentation. What work has been done in that regard? And the other question also I would like to ask you, the areas that are, I suppose, highlighted as if I could use the word prone maybe to TB, are they the same areas that were prone to TB over a number of years, or have the black spot areas been eradicated to a certain extent? And then I'll take a Deputy Cahill maybe next, and Deputy Penrose, and Senator Mulhern in that order. Thank
you, Chairman. I'd just like to thank the officials for their presentation. Again, like yourself, I'm extremely disappointed that we've got a presentation on TB and no mention of the deer population and the problems that the deer population is causing. And this seems to be a common theme with the department, that there is no recognition of the fact that deer are infected with TB. And I was told lately that where post-mortems have been done on deer, that up to 18% of deer are shown up with TB. And like farmers in West Wicklow, some farmers in West Wicklow have stopped keeping cattle altogether because they failed. They're failing to get clear of TB, and the deer is definitely the root cause of the infection for them. Now, experts will tell you that the deer are infected from the badger, that the deer aren't the source of the infection. But the reality is that deer are infected with TB, and the deer population with forestry is increasing very dramatically. And in my own county, we had a few very serious breakdowns, and a significant amount of them have been on the edge of forestry. And to tell farmers now that deer haven't played a huge part in the spread of TB just wouldn't wash. And I think our reluctance to tackle the deer population and our reluctance to cull some of the deers, we're just definitely not going to get to grips with the TB situation. And your paragraph, the paragraph there when you're finishing your presentation, working together with stakeholders, we can eradicate TB by 2030. But to do so will require some decisions that may be difficult for some in the short term. The only one that TB has cost money in this country is farmers, and it has cost farmers a huge amount of money. And whether the on-farm valuation system, or the loss of animals and the severe hardship that's incurred at farm level, whatever decisions are taken by the department, at the end of the day, unfortunately, these farmers will pay for that financially. And I have serious concerns about this figure too, where there seems to be now a focus by the department to say that herds that have had TB are a risk for a number of years afterwards. And what that is doing then is putting a black mark against herds that unfortunately have had TB and have had a couple of clear tests. But if I understand clearly now, what you're saying is even for up to 10 years, if you've had TB in the previous 10 years, that your herd will have a stigma attached to it. And if that's going to be the case, and I've heard said that this will be put up on that a farmer's TB history, the herd's TB history, will be put up on boards in March. That will obviously mean that these herds, cattle being stored from these herds or weanlings or whatever, will have a reduced attractiveness for buyers, and obviously will receive a lower price. And to me, this is a serious. First of all, to me, it shows that there's not confidence in the TB test, because surely, if we're after having two clear tests, your herd is clear of TB, and now you're saying that for up to 10 years, animals coming from this herd can be of a greater risk. I just find that I just can't. As a farmer, I just can't get my head around that, and I can't accept it. And it's going to cause huge costs and will put huge hardship on farmers. And I just can't see the benefit of it. On the badgers, the badger cull has worked very well, and has where it has been done, definitely has reduced the level of TB. But if there is a successful vaccination for badgers, why do we have to have a cull? Could we not, get to a level where we have a blanket vaccination of badgers? Because taking out healthy badgers, culling healthy badgers is actually a hindrance rather than a help. So if we had a vaccination process, wouldn't that, if we could get badgers that they weren't transmitting the disease, I think we would be making large steps forward. And I would like to see, why can't the vaccination be more widely used? The blood test, and where there is a breakdown, the department now have come in and insisting on doing the blood test. And in fairness, I agree with that principle. But what are the figures available of the false positives that a blood test might throw up as against the skin test? And I do agree that the blood test, will find the source will find reactor animals quicker than the skin test. But is there, what are the figures as regards false positives? Another question I'd just like to ask, we look at the map here on the back page, and we see the 6 counties up here, blank. What level of TB have we in Northern Ireland? What are the regulations as regards TB up there, and are they compatible with our own? And I was president of a farming organisation before I came into this house, and I remember with brucellosis, we virtually had brucellosis eradicated, and South Armagh reinfected us, and we were back to square one. So, is there a compatible level of testing in Northern Ireland? Because if we do Everton A1 down here and there's not the same level up there, we're going to get reinfected. But I would be disappointed that there's not a focus on the deer population and the deer's role in transmitting the disease. I accept that they're not the primary source of infection, but in my view and in the experience I see on the ground, they definitely have a serious role in transmitting the disease, and they travel fast. They travel a lot of the countryside, and I think they're a serious problem. And a farmer will tell you he can come out and he can see 40, 50 deers in his eating silage out of his pit or in his feed of grass. And obviously they're drinking out of the same water trucks, because with the badgers, we lived water trucks in the past and it stopped badgers getting access to water. Unfortunately, that won't help with deers, and deers will have access to the same water sources as the herd. So there are a number of questions I would like to answer, Minister or Chairman, but who will pay for these decisions will be difficult in the short term. It has always been farmers that have had the financial repercussions.
Deputy Penrose, next, please.
Thank you for your presentation. Of course, having one's herd locked up is, as they say, represents a severe and traumatic blow to the farmers affected, and of course, it impacts upon the whole family, and it represents a significant blow to the income generating capacity, as well, of the farm and of the farmers involved. And of course, the devastation just then inside the farm gate, it spreads to contiguous and neighbouring farmers, because they are now caught up in something of not their own making and become subject to tests by virtue of their location as opposed to a disease history. And that's significant when that word comes. I know when it happened around the wrong place, it represents, it sends a lot of fear and trepidation, because they could be next. And you see, farmers never ever receive the replacement costs of the lost animals or herds, a herd of animals. And of course, the whole dilemma is aggravated or exacerbated by the fact that replacement costs are going to be significant and represents, in effect, a double whammy for the farmer involved. They're getting less for what they're been taken away from them, and they're going to have to pay a bigger cost. So it is. I kind of enjoy the fact, not so much enjoy, but a major policy objective is to eradicate TB by 2030. And but Marcella and Senator Daly come from part of the country where most people, this is a very desirable objective, but we also come from part of the country. We used to hear that the mantra that the various ministers and governments used to drain the Shannon every so often. And I think we can throw this into the drain the Shannon thing. Because, you know, we've committed to drain the Shannon every year, and many a TD won or lost their seats or ministers on that thing. And I'm beginning to wonder, is this a bit like that? Because when I was a very young person, back in 1974, with black hair, I remember this was a desirable objective as well at that time. And that's what, 44, 45, whatever the years it is now. Yeah. So, I mean, I hope it's achieved, because for everybody's sake, not just for everybody's sake, even from a human health perspective. And I'm glad that you acknowledged Noel Brown, one of the greatest politicians ever stood this place, in it. And I'm glad that the Department of Agriculture, at least, has spread to acknowledging the great work that that man done against the odds and against the tide, as he says himself. But, you know, how much has the state invested to date in the TB eradication scheme? Now, we're down to 16 or 17,000 or maybe 18,000 animals, and about less than 3.5% of the herds are affected. And that means that almost 97%. And of course, this is important in terms of the export. 9 of every 10 animals going across out here. It's absolutely critical. And that's why we have all the identification things and everything else in place. But, of course, when you look at the number of herds we've had since the mid-50s has declined rapidly. But the number of animals, of course, has gone the other way. So we have a smaller number of herds having a larger number of animals. So the impact is in a reverse situation. The BCG vaccine that you've tried in badgers in Ireland, I used to always hear that this was the one major source. But why is the National Parks and Wildlife, why would they impose a 30% limit on the usage of it? Is there any scientific basis for that being imposed? Or where did that come over? Is there an empirical basis, or is it just something that they have in that regard? You know, we all know about the epidermal test and the skin test, or what we like to call it now, and the annual rounds, and the great joy at getting the annual round test clear when the word comes through after the veterinary practitioner carries out the review. But how extensively has the gamma interferon blood test, how extensively has that been used? If it's more succinct and precise and facilitates the earlier detection of TB, is that used pretty extensively? Like my colleagues, I intended to raise the issue on the impact of deer, on whether do they facilitate the spread of TB as a potential host or carrier, at least a carrier or transmitter of the disease. Have you carried out any research in that or in that context? How sensitive is the intradermal tuberculin test in identifying infected animals? And what percentage of animals could be identified by means of the test as being positive when they're in fact uninfected? And indeed, the reverse might be the case. So animals identified as being negative, but they were affected. It'd be interesting to see. How many chronically infected herds are in the country? And has there been any impact on these numbers over the past 5 to 10 years? And this is one that I don't know. I mean, I know I studied this zoonotic disease and all this stuff and mycobacteria and all of that back years ago. Probably we've all forgotten now. But very often, it can be the experience of a herd owner, farmer, who was a herd breakdown affected by the TB, and to take what are, you know, working with yourselves, taking significant preventative steps, a closed herd policy, detailed disinfectant policy, increased hygiene, all of the steps that you would be normally taking. And yet, as you said yourself there very fairly, there's almost a 10-year, within 3 or 4 or 5 years, you hear them, they're gone again. You know what I mean? They're affected again. So is this window, I'd say you're right. Does it extend to a decade or more before you can never drop your guard? I appreciate that, and that's going to be part of your, I'm sure, your lectures and videos and the devil knows what. You can never drop your guard. But is there a peak when it's likely to come again? You know what I mean? You know where it starts on the logarithmic thing, like the usual bacteria, the growth almost culture, like, and then it drops off. Is there a real sensitive period? Is it 3 years, 4 years, 5 years when you want to be even, you just don't let anybody near the lane? You know, you have to be so careful. But I'd ask if you could answer those questions.
Thanks, Deputies. I might actually go back to maybe Mr. Sheenan first of all. We'll take those questions first, then we'll come back to the other members.
So I think there was about 10 questions there, so if I forget any, you can remind me. So I'll do them, not necessarily, I'll leave the deer until last, and I might ask my colleague Owen to answer that one. So just some of the questions, Chairman, I think you asked about black spot areas. I think you asked, do they change from, is it always the same black spot area? No, they change, from time to time. So just to give recent examples, we had a sudden large outbreak in part of South Kerry, which hadn't previously had particular problems for many, many years. So that became a black spot area, and we put a particular programme in place to deal with that, So that was a new area that hadn't been a problem before. We currently, I suppose, Monaghan would be the most, probably the most significant large-scale problem area we have. That developed relatively quickly after 4 or 5 years of not being particularly above the national average. So sometimes diseases break up in an area, flare up in an area, and we put a programme in place and squash it down. But over time, the number of black spot areas is getting less and less as we get the overall disease levels down.
If I ask a question, coming from where I come from in Carlow, not too far from West Wicklow, I will be well aware West Wicklow has been a problem area for quite a while.
West Wicklow has been a particular problem for, and we talk about that in relation to deer. But in general, black spot areas, mostly they sort of come and go, and we deal with them. And as the disease levels drop, we get fewer black spot areas.
Just to follow up, sorry, I couldn't question there on that point as well. I'm looking at the map there, where there's a lot of red. The only part of the country where there's red at the moment, and it's the border area, we'll say. It's Monaghan. Monaghan. Has that been a constant? I know you said it has been. No, that's a relatively, recent thing in the last sort of 2 years. I say we now have a comprehensive programme in place to deal with it, and we're confident the graph will go down again next year.
Okay, sorry. In relation to, I think Deputy Cahill asked about blanket vaccination of badgers. Why don't we move to blanket vaccination of badgers? So that is our plan, So at the moment, we're typically, in recent years, we've been culling roughly 6,000 badgers a year and vaccinating roughly 1,000 badgers a year. We're now rolling out vaccination, gradually over the next 3 or 4 years. So in general terms, we'll be switching over to, in 4 years' time, we'll be vaccinating 6,000 badgers a year and culling 1,000 badgers a year. So over the course of time, we are planning to move away from culling by and large, and our plan is ultimately to vaccinate every badger in the country as far as possible, while still maintaining, we'll still need to do some culling in some areas where there's particularly bad outbreaks of disease, but in general our plan is to move to blanket vaccination of badgers. And I think possibly Deputy Penrose asked, why is there a 30% limit? So just to clarify, there's no limit on vaccination. We can vaccinate every badger in the country. Parks and Wildlife have no difficulty with that. But because of the Berne Convention and because badgers are a protected species, that's why there's a limit of 30% in relation to the land area in which we can cull badgers. It's part of the need to. We can't exterminate the badger population. It's as simple as that. So that's why there was a 30% limit. In relation to Deputy Penrose comparing this to draining the Shannon, I mean, I'm sure he wasn't being entirely serious, but You know, I was,
Since 1954, 55.
yeah, well, I was in the department. I'm in the department quite a while now, and back in 1999, I got involved in our brucellosis eradication program, and I suppose at that stage, brucellosis was at an all-time high, and we got the same thing that we've heard it all before. We launched a program in 1999 to eradicate brucellosis, and at the time, you know, there was a lot of scepticism that it wouldn't be done, it couldn't be done, and it's all a racket, and it's a vet's gravy train, and all that sort of nonsense. But with a concerted program, and in fairness, again, a key point was the support to stakeholders. All the farm bodies were fully on board. ICOS, Meat Industry, everybody accepted it was the right thing to do, and everybody worked together. And to everyone's surprise, within 7 years, we had eradicated brucellosis. So our last case of brucellosis was in 2006. So it was a prime example of what can be done when everybody is pulling together, you know. So this is the first time that we're making an attempt. You know, I'm sure people have said it before, oh, it'd be great to eradicate TB, but this is the first time that we've actually got a planning programme, we've got government, cabinet backing for it, and our intention is we accept we will not eradicate TB on our own as a department. We simply can't. We do need the support of stakeholders because there are a few difficult decisions will have to be made if we're to achieve it by 2030. But certainly everyone here is confident that with the support of stakeholders it can be done. Okay. In relation to the gamma interferon test, the blood test, I think a couple of people asked how first of all, how widely has it been used? So basically, we're now using the gamma interferon blood test in all bad breakdowns, so in all breakdowns with 5 or more reactors. Okay, so it's a standard practice now across the country. That's something we've learned a lot over the years about how best to use the gamma interferon test, and we're now using it in all breakdown herds. As a follow-on question, I think Deputy Penrose asked, you know, how many false positives are there with the blood test? About 3%. So for every 100 animals you blood test, its sensitivity is 97%. So you'll get 3 false positives in every 100 animals you test, and that's the reason why we. Sorry.
What's the level for skin test?
I'll come to that in a second. Now, just to finish on the blood test.
Sorry,
so the reason we don't use the blood test widely on the 6 million cattle is because the false positive rate is too high to use it as a screening test. Okay, so but we are now using it in all significant breakdowns. Okay, so 97% sensitivity. The false positive rate, false positive rate I should say is 3%. Yeah. With the skin test, the false positive rate is tiny. Okay, so about 1 in 5,000 reactors is false positive with the skin test. Okay, so it's an excellent. No, it's very specific. So very few false positives. Okay, so if you test 5,000, if you get 5,000 reactors, only 1 of those will be a false positive. Okay, and that's an important point. On the other hand, the sensitivity, in other words, the ability of the test to pick out infected animals with the skin test is only 80%. Okay, so if there's 100 animals in a pen with TB, the skin test will pick up 80. Now that's actually pretty good as tests go. There's no test for any disease 100%. That will pick out 100% in humans or animals. So 80% is actually relatively good. Okay.
What's the blood test pick out as a percentage?
A little bit more than that, and it'll pick them out at a bit of an earlier stage as well, which is an important point. It picks the blood test will go positive before the skin test. So you're getting in earlier and clearing out herds quicker.
A certain percentage will get through both nets. So.
A certain percent, yes. Neither of those tests is perfect, and that's the reason why I think it was yourself, Deputy Cahill, that asked if a herd's had 2 clear tests. Surely that means that's the problem solved. It's not, unfortunately. The tests are not good enough. And there's no prospect, there's no magic, there's nobody out there developing a test that's in the short term. There's no within the next 5 or 10 years. There's no likelihood that there's going to be a better test coming along. Despite you'll read from time to time about breakthroughs and new tests under development. We'd love if there was, but the reality is the tests we have are pretty good as disease tests go. But they will not, you know, if you do 2 clear tests in a herd that's had a problem. Unfortunately, a certain percentage of infected animals will be left behind in some herds. So currently we're finding that about 30% of herds that have had a breakdown will go down again at some stage in the future. That's better than what we were doing before. So the blood test is helping. It is getting out more animals, but still a percentage of infected animals are being left behind and not being picked up. Okay, and that's why there's a risk for up to 10 years associated with herds that have had significant TB breakdowns. I think Deputy Penrose asked about chronic herds. Depending on your definition of chronic herds, there's about we have all the figures on the number of herds that have had 6 or more breakdowns. So some herds have 1 breakdown and that's it, they're clear and it doesn't happen again. But there are some chronic herds, and between 500 and 1,000 herds have a significant number of repeat breakdowns, and they're an area we're certainly going to focus on, and we are focusing on at the moment. False positives at blood test. We were asked about the level of TB in Northern Ireland. So rough, I don't know, have we got an exact figure? So it's about 9%. Our herd incidence rate at the moment is about 3.5%. In the north, it's about 9%. So they have a much more serious problem than we have. Okay, and again, as you probably know, they don't have a badger culling programme in the north at the moment. Okay.
As far as interested, are they as concerned about it? Obviously, they should be, as we are down here.
Absolutely. My colleagues were meeting with the north yesterday on TB. So it's, I mean, to some extent they're a bit hamstrung at the moment for political reasons because there isn't an assembly in place. They have they got an independent body to produce a report on what they should be doing, but they've been a bit hamstrung as regards actually getting on and doing it because of the situation up there at the moment. But yes, they're absolutely very concerned.
And if I may ask a stupid question, with the events in Brexit and so on and so forth, does that present another challenge in that regard?
It probably will. I mean, it probably will further complicate things depending on what happens. So I might ask my colleague Owen to talk about the deer question, because it's one that comes up very, very commonly. Yep. And there is a...
I think Deputy Cahill mentioned about the herd history up in the mark boards.
Oh, yeah. So just, I mean, that's one of, there's a number of options being discussed at the moment in the TB forum. And I suppose, going back to what we talked about risk, the reality is, just to give an example, if you're a dairy farmer with a 200 cow herd, you have a lot of money invested in your herd and in your facilities, and you need to buy 20 cattle. The last thing you want to do, obviously, is to buy a TB problem. But at the moment, you're buying a pig in a poke. You have no way of knowing whether I should buy my 20 cattle from Joe Bloggs or Paddy Smith or who. Whereas we know, we have the information, we know with a good degree of accuracy what your risk will be by buying from that herd as distinct from buying from that herd. So the question is, could we or should we make that information available to the person with the 200 dairy herd or even the 50 suckler cow, whatever it is? Should we make that information available? Do they have a right to know which is the lowest risk herd? Should they buy, or should we be warning them, if you buy from that herd, your risk of buying in a problem is X. If you buy from that herd, it's Y. So these are some of the difficult decisions. And obviously, if you're
devaluing an individual's stock.
You are. Yeah. There's two sides to the coin. So if you're somebody who wants to buy cattle, if you're one of the 97% of herds who's clear from TB, with a significant investment in your herd, obviously you have a vested interest in knowing what the risk is from buying from one herd as distinct from another. If on the other hand, and if you're somebody who's selling, who has a good TB-free, you've had no TB in your herd for 10 years, obviously you wouldn't have a problem with making that fact known on a mark board or wherever else. If on the other hand, you're one of the people who has had 16 breakdowns in the last 7 years, you will not want, you won't want that information to be made available to somebody looking to buy cattle from you, because, as you say, inevitably nobody in their right mind will want to buy cattle from you.
That might be extreme now, I'd say, would it?
That's extreme. Yeah, that's extreme. But there's different ranges of risks in there.
But as it is, obviously you can't sell any livestock in the market without having a clear test.
Correct.
And that is the way as it is. But it would sound unfair, when I take a point about the whole issue, it would sound unfair that if you're going to influence the price of somebody's stock in the mark by having their particular herd history displayed on the mark board. Like, for example, if it's a suckler herd, and we hear on a regular basis in this committee here about the challenges in this whole suckler area at the moment. Like, the margins are tight. Yep. If you were potentially going to influence the price of their stock, Whelan's, for example, now this time of the year, a bit earlier in the year, it could have a knock-on effect on the viability of that herd. and the viability of the farm family.
Yeah.
Chair,
Yeah.
on this topic.
Yeah.
I mean, yet.
Sorry for
just when we're discussing that topic, rather than me bringing it all up again,
Yeah.
I was going to, and I suppose there's no better man to use an example as yourself. And I'm a suckler man, but I breed purebred, and I'm supplying purebred bulls. I haven't had TB in the last 10 years. I farm very close to the esker. It's a big wildlife habitat. There's a lot of badgers around, so the risk is always there. So basically what you're saying by publishing that information, if I had a reactor next year, it would be the first in 10 years, but I might as well fold up the tent for the next 10 years. And that's the reality, and I'm only one of many examples. You know, I'm using myself as an example, but I could close the gate if you're going to keep publishing that I had a reactor for the next 10 years and at the same time stating that there can be a 10-year dormant history or whatever, and I heard it'll be 10 years before I will be fully in your eyes clear again. I'm out of business. And while I'm talking, I'm being personal, I am one of many. You know, there's two sides to every coin.
There are.
You know,
Yeah,
there's no point, well, we want to eradicate the disease, and there's no point in helping the people that you've quoted who will be helping from the purchasing side, but at the expense of putting people on the other side out of business. Where do you get the happy medium in that one?
Well, that is, you know, so that's one. So just to emphasise, this is not a proposal from the Department of Agriculture. This is one of many issues that we're discussing at the forum. We're giving people the science. We're saying the science from UCD says, if we wanted to eradicate TB in the quickest time possible, we would bring in a thing called risk-based trading, which essentially is what they do in New Zealand and what they're beginning to do in the UK and whatever, where you give people the information in relation to the risk of the animals they're buying. So it is a very tricky, I completely accept it. There are two sides to the coin. As I say, if you're somebody with the dairy herd who's clear, you know, you want that information, but if you're somebody who's selling cattle who has had an issue, you know,
most likely,
so
it wouldn't really affect the dairy farmer as much because he most likely will be producing his own replacements and he will have the continuous cash flow as opposed to the suckler farmer who will be selling the weanlings, we'll say, for example, every fall or whatever else.
well, actually, to some extent,
And it's a tighter margin, obviously, as well in the suckler herd.
yeah, I suppose increasingly, dairy farmers are buying replacement.
Well, they could, yeah.
So increasingly, dairy farmers are, with expansion in particular, of, you know, most dairy farmers have been buying replacement heifers in recent years, you know, and stock bulls and so on, you know. So, but anyway, look, this is, as I say, this is not a Department of Agriculture proposal. This is something that's been discussed at the TB Forum. It is one of many tricky decisions that people will have to, the stakeholders will have to agree on, and it is a difficult one, you know. So it's, as I say, it's for the forum to, if they can, to reach a consensus on it. And there may be some halfway house, you know, in relation to the issue, but it is a tricky one with both two sides of the story. So
Okay.
we'll ask Owen to talk on the deer.
Yeah, please, yeah.
Microphone on. So, first of all, thank you for the invitation to appear. As Michael Sheehan said, there's a lot of stakeholder engagement going on at the moment. We have been involved in a lot of public meetings recently, and I myself have gone around the country with my colleagues. A lot of meetings with public meetings, farm organisations, and the deer issue does come up repeatedly. So, you know, I know exactly where, you know, the strength of feeling comes on from this. And I suppose I'll say now what I say repeatedly at these public meetings and with the bilaterals with the farm organisations, and actually I've been interviewed a few times by farm media on these things. And really, it's the case that there's no evidence that deer play a significant role in transmitting TB to cattle in most of the country outside Wicklow. Now I'll deal with Wicklow first. Wicklow is a particular type of area where, you know, actually most land is not farmed in Wicklow. Of course, farmers are not the majority type of landowners there. There's a huge deer population in Wicklow, and Deputy Cahill is right. There was a department-funded research project done a few years ago that found, I think it was about 16% of deer shot at this pilot project in Wicklow had TB, and that the same strains of TB were circulating in cattle, badgers and deer in this particular part of Wicklow. And the department is facilitating farmers to take action in Wicklow in relation to this. In fact, tomorrow I'm attending a meeting on this in Wicklow, where we have a Wicklow Deer Management Committee attended by farm organisations, National Parks and Wildlife, Coillte, ourselves, just local hunters as well, facilitating farmers and hunters who want to shoot deer, reduce the number of them there. And that's been working quite well, and I think there was just a tender was just signed off there a few months ago to renew that and extend it across Wicklow. Outside Wicklow, though, It just isn't the case that there's evidence deer are playing a role in transmitting TB to cattle at significant levels. I'm not saying it doesn't happen at all, but we have to try to base our policies on what the evidence is and what the risks are. So, for instance, in the last year and a half, we have tested 74 wild deer in our regional veterinary laboratories from across the country outside Wicklow. Only 3 of those 74 actually had TB. So, for instance, when we were at the public meeting in Killarney, I was asked about this. There was concern that deer in Kerry were driving TB levels. So it was reassuring to be able to provide the information to farmers there that of 39 wild deer tested in Kerry in the last year and a half, only 1 of those 39 had TB. In the meeting we had in Nina there a couple of weeks ago, some people from Clare were quite concerned. Well, we tested 16 deer from Clare recently, 0 of them had TB. So it's certainly the case that deer can get infected with TB, and it certainly is the case that it's conceivable that deer can pass it to cattle. But the question isn't whether it ever happens at all, it's whether this is a significant route of infection. Now, having said that, we're happy to continue to look at this, and in fact, just our policy is the same as it's always been, but we're trying to do better in communicating this, that where there's local concerns that deer may be an issue, so if there's a particular area where farmers, as the scenario you outlined, are concerned that deer are a factor, we're happy to test deer if farmers want to coordinate locally, get deer shot, submit them to a regional veterinary laboratory. We'll test them for free, pass that information back on, and we're also happy to facilitate local meetings between farmers, landowners and hunters to try to address that. And that's what we do, and that's where a lot of these deer that are shot come in. And at the moment, we're happy to do that, and that policy is on our website. I've spoken about it several times, and the farm organisations are aware of it. But maybe we need to do better in getting that out there, because I completely agree with the point you made. There is a perception that the department maybe is sort of saying we don't want to talk about deer. Well, actually, we're happy to talk about deer, but we're even happier to talk about the things for which there's evidence that we should put our efforts into. So if it is the case that evidence comes to light that there's some part of the country where actually deer are playing a significant role in spreading TB to cattle, well, we're happy to support measures to address that, and farmers can take steps to reduce the numbers of deer. It's difficult for a single farmer to do that, of course. They can shoot them, and if it's out of season, they can apply for a Section 42 licence in the National Parks and Wildlife Service. But it's more effective if they coordinate locally across an area. That's the approach that's been done in Wicklow involving the farm organisations, and we're happy for that to be taken, that approach to be taken elsewhere. It just hasn't arisen. So again, it's not that we're saying deer never ever pass TB to cattle, but it is the case that outside Wicklow there's no evidence they play a significant role. Even within Wicklow, it's not clear which species is transmitting to which, but we're working, like I said, I'm attending a meeting tomorrow in Wicklow with the local management partnership there. So I hope that provides some information on deer anyway.
Yeah.
Great information, but I wouldn't be happy with the answer now, with all due respect, Mr. Ryan. Like, I can list 7 or 8 instances in my own county where there's been bad breakdowns of TB in the last year and a half to 2 years. The vast majority of them are bound in forestry, and the deer is grazing the same land as the cattle, drinking the same water. Like, to say that that you're contending that the deer isn't playing a part in transmitting the infection, I just can't understand that. Like you said, in Wicklow there were 16% of the deers found with TB, and you quoted their figures from other places. But like, to expect the farmers to be able to get a significant cull of deer is expecting too much. Like, deer population is expanding rapidly. There's no doubt in my mind deer have TB. The percentage, I think, is the only thing that's in question. And like, we're talking there about putting serious restrictions on farmers and different things. Like, you talked there about brucellosis, that like farmers went through huge expense to get to eradicate brucellosis between post-movement tests and pre-movement tests and all the rest. But brucellosis, was confined. I know wildlife could spread it, but if you could contain the infection in the dairy herd or the suckler herd in the female population, you were able to control brucellosis. The same thing doesn't hold for TB at all. And like, if we don't tackle the deer population, and like, if the deer stayed in their own habitats, it would be fine. But the deer population is expanding so rapidly; they're not staying in their own habitats, and they're using the same habitats now as the farm animals. And definitely, I know Rossmore and Tipperary, there was 2 bad outbreaks, 2 herds completely out. Killascully at the moment, there's 10 or 12 herds locked up. And and so are the farmers are convinced that his deer are at the root of their problems. So, you know, to get farmers' confidence in trying to reduce the figures of reactors down more, the deer question, there's going to have to be a lot more research put into deers and a lot more controlling of the deer population.
I take on board what you're saying, but it is the case, say for instance in Tipperary we've tested 3 deer in the last while and none of them had TB, and I'm familiar with the outbreak in Killascully. If people there want to shoot some deer and get them submitted to us, we'll test them for free, and then, you know, we can actually have some data, and I said that the other night at Nina. We've said that, you know, at multiple public meetings. So if farmers are concerned, we're happy to test those deer. That can be arranged. There's no problem with that. But we can't, you know, operate on the basis of things for which there isn't evidence. It just is the case that outside Wicklow, when we test the deer, we find very, very few of them. 3 out of 74 have TB. And because deer may share the same habitat as cattle doesn't mean they're driving infection into them. So any mammal in the countryside can get TB. TB can infect any mammal really. It's entirely possible that deer may be a spillover host, that they may pick up infection from cattle or badgers or whatever. That doesn't necessarily mean they'll pass it back on. In relation to forestry, you mentioned that, well, and this came up at our TV forum, so it was suggested by the farm organisations that Cahill should be invited as the largest landowner in the country. They're invited along, and I have to say they made a very positive contribution. And the point you made about the association, or the perceived association between forestry and particularly between clear felling and possibly TB outbreaks was put to us. So we're going to carry out some research on that, and as you suggest yourself, actually look at it, and rather than say, well, you know, it could be this, it could be that, to actually look, is there a correlation between, proximity to forestry and risk of TB? So, you know, our feeling with a lot of this is the answer is to actually look at the evidence and look at the data, and then to base the policy on that. And we'll have an answer to that then. So it's another example of how I think, you know, our increased engagement with stakeholders and discussion here has borne fruit. You know, that's something that was a concern, and we're moving to address that now. But, you know,
has there been no research or done into that at the moment between the correlation between the TB and forest? Because I would have seen from experience myself that anywhere there was a forest, we'll say, there was inevitably a breakdown of TB within a short period of time. Obviously, when you have a forest, you have cover for the badger, you have cover for the deer, and it tends to, from my experience, maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, well, I mean, I suppose that's the thing. I can't say whether you're right. Like, although of course people might be aware of a specific instance of a breakdown where they're familiar with it, they maybe know the person involved, or it's in their area and it's close to forestry. There's lots of farms that are close to forestry, and maybe the ones that aren't affected by TB don't spring to mind. So I think the answer is to look at it. There's, you know, that's what we're doing, and you know, I suppose we want to base what we're doing on the results of that analysis. So, like, we are doing that, and that's what, you know, the direction we'll go in.
Okay. There was one final question before I sorry, yeah.
Sorry for you get in, just to finish the TB. And are you suggesting, Mr. Ryan, that there's evidence to say that deer won't transmit TB back to cattle? You're not?
No, I said.
And is there evidence to say that they will? I'm not trying to be awkward with you now.
Well, I mean, just to be clear again, it's entirely possible for any mammal to get infected with TB and to infect another mammal. The question isn't whether any deer in the country ever got TB and passed it to a bovine. It's whether it happens in a significant way that it's a factor for people to be concerned about. So outside, you know, it's impossible to say that it has never happened that a deer hasn't infected a bovine. There's certainly evidence that in Wicklow the same strains are affecting cattle, badgers and deer. So whether it's all 3 infecting each other, whether it's moving around there, but outside Wicklow, you know, we have the data that I've explained here. We've only found 3 positive deer out of the 74 wild deer that were shot and submitted to us. If farmers in a local area like Killascully or wherever else are concerned, we're happy to test those deer. It's entirely possible that there may be a role being played. I'm certainly not disputing that at all. But what we want to do is base our control policies on the risks. So, for instance, Michael Sheehan mentioned earlier the various risks, and you addressed the point yourself that it is it is a difficult message to say that a herd which has had a TB breakdown is at higher risk for several years after. But although that message is difficult, it doesn't mean that it's wrong to address it and to say, well, this is what the research bears out. It's awkward and it's difficult, but it still is the case. It's not all bad news. I mean, the risk of herds breaking down has reduced over the previous years. So say, I think the figures for in 1998, a herd had a 46% chance of going down within 3 years. From 2012, it only had a 30% chance of going down in the next 3 years. And our preliminary data is that has slightly decreased again for herds from 2015, although the analysis isn't finished. So the risk can decrease and it can be done, but we have to be driven by what the findings are. So I don't dispute at all that deer can infect cattle, but what I do dispute is that it's a significant, or that there's evidence that it plays a significant role outside Wicklow. But I'm happy to look at that evidence, and we say repeatedly, if farmers have concerns, we're happy to test those deer. We'll do it for free, and we'll support local meetings on that. It's no problem at all.
Okay. Senator Daly was in half-floor there earlier on, and Senator Lombard is back as well.
No, just briefly, Chair, because I said it come in rather than going over all around. I said it come in on the history being published. I just have a couple of questions. I don't want it to come across wrong, because they're going to sound like I'm asking why aren't there more, you know. A bit of information, I suppose, from the veterinary side on the biological makeup of the animal, and why, when there's TB in a herd, why you can hear, which I do a lot, because I wouldn't be in what you'd call a very bad area, sporadic area, but there seems to be one or two in a lot of herds here and there, and it could be clear for 5 or 6 years, and then there's one again. Like, what's the biological makeup of the animal that if there's TB in a herd, that they don't all have it? You know, if there's badgers or deer or whoever it may be, or whatever it may be, if they can infect one animal, and that animal isn't cross-infecting the rest of the herd, that farmer can have 2 or 3 clear tests once that one animal is gone. The badger's still there, the deer is still there, the rest of the animals are still in the herd, and he or a neighbour might have another reactor then maybe 4 or 5 years later, and again it's just a one-off. Why when it's in, do they not all get it? How can you explain this, like, sporadic here and there? And is there a correlation? Is there studied on, or do you have statistics or figures on the prevalence in what we call indigenous herds, predominantly indigenous herds, or import herds? You know, maybe people who are fattening cattle and buying in, as was mentioned earlier on, or somebody who is predominantly breeding, maybe like a dairy farmer, he's breeding his own replacement heifers, where there wouldn't be that many animals being imported. Is there any correlation between those two? And I wonder, is there any follow-up research, or do you have any statistics or figures on where TB is at in countries where we are live exporting to? Has there ever been any red flags raised that there's TB there for the first time, or there never was before, and it's coming from Ireland, or is there none whatsoever in some of the countries we're sending live exports to, which would eliminate the badger and the deer to start with, if there is? And if there isn't, it might eliminate a lot of what you're saying here today about the herd and the 10-year possibility of it erupting again within our own animals, from animal to animal.
Senator Lombard, please.
Thank you, Chair. So I apologise for stepping outside there to go and vote. I'd like to welcome the members of the department and the veterinary people regarding this issue. I can hear to declare vested interest in this case, but I won't. I think it's one of the key issues. Now, I was speaking to Michael about this maybe 12 months ago. I think it's one of the key issues that's going to be troubling the farming community about how this actual focus group is going to go and how this forum is going to go. Key issues that are concerning the agricultural community would be, one, the 10-year history. I think the 10-year history, as it might be a tool in the forum, as it's been discussed, to get information out there, the general farming community would be very, very concerned about how that would impact on, number one, I suppose, financially. Will there be a real financial package in place if you were to have your herd devalued for a 10-year period? Whether it's selling weanlings, whether it's selling in calf heifers, the logic would be, if that information was out there, you'd be very slow to engage. And I think that's something that would need to be talked about. And has there been any figures put in the forum about what the actual budget would be required to financially support the agricultural community while they go through this 10-year hardship of having their herd as good as devalued because their information is out there. And that's one of the key issues that they've been talking about. We spoke about, a previous colleague spoke about exports. There was an issue last year regarding exports of calves and licensing of exports of calves that came from herds that were restricted over a certain period of time. Have all those issues been actually cleared up, or what is the dilemma going into the kind of February, March, April, May time of exports of large numbers, and particularly of dairy bull calves? In my part of the world, it's a big issue. We have an awful lot of calves going abroad. There was issues last year that came through the marks regarding those calves. I was spoken to Michael about it previously. Where are we now regarding that issue? Regarding the 12 and the two blood test issues, there is, as much as they've been welcomed, there is confusion out there. And I think there's confusion about how sensitive are the results and when we actually take the results. Is there a protocol set across the entire department? Or is it up to every individual veterinary inspector in Clonakilty or wherever else to make up his mind when that actually goes into process? And what is the protocol, if there is a protocol? Regarding the actual time of movement of reactor animals from farms, is there a strict protocol in place for the Department of Agriculture to have an animal moved within so many days? I've had situations where it's been a month before you could start the retesting process. You're a spring calver, you need to get bull calves moved, you're waiting for a month animal to be moved because of lack of capacity in a factory. Huge issue out there. Is there going to be a protocol put in place that puts pressure on the department to have the animal moved within certain days? Or what is your view on that? Having a reactor on the farm realistically is against all protocol if you have an animal there for 30 days, and we've had that situation before. So I want your view regarding that. Forestry. The issue of forestry, and I think Mr. Owen Ryan mentioned it, regarding felling of forestry. The information I would always got from veterinary practice regarding my part of the world is where you have a forest being felled, the level of TB in that area is going to dramatically increase. Is that information different to what the department's research is, or have we actually have genuine research on the ground? And the other issue then comes down to information and information meetings. If you have a reactor, you do get the department to call. The department will go through issues. How many times does the department call outside of that circle? Or do you actually have to have a breakdown before you get that information? And what information circle has the department put in place, or will the department be putting in place an information circle to inform farmers of what they need to do to limit their actual issues itself? I'm farming 22 years. I've only ever seen the department fellow when I break down, and I've broken down several times. What is the department's long-term focus? Is it going to be a part of discussion groups? Is it going to be a part of single farm payments? When will, or if, is there staffing? Is there people? Is there the ability to get that information out there? And how can we get that information out there? Thank you, Chair.
Apologies, I had a vote to go to on the channel, so I hope I'm not going to duplicate any questions. I suppose, firstly, on a maybe lighter note, it struck me when you said you're very hopeful you'll have it eradicated by 2030. I'm on the Climate Action Committee, as are a number of my colleagues, and we'd love to be able to be saying the same thing about our targets, so that's a positive. Just a few questions, really. I know that mention was made of your map on the back, figure 3, and the hot spot or the red spots in Cavan, in Monaghan, and the surrounding area. And I don't know if you were asked, like, what cause has been identified. You know, what's because you said it's just arisen in the last few years, really, that it's gone red, and what's the source or the cause of it, and how is infection being passed? Is it badgers? Is it cattle, or what? And just another question, because it is an issue that gets coverage from time to time in the media, and it seems to flare up, is the whole issue of cattle rustling. And have you ever sort of quantified what impact this has had in the spread of disease in cattle? are there cases where it's been found that this activity has actually resulted in spreading disease? On the issue of transmission, actually on the issue of other countries and regimes in other countries, and I'm talking about outside the European Union, the likes of Argentina, where we already receive beef. We receive beef from Argentina under trade agreement, and the push for more, and Brazilian beef and that. What are their regimes like? I suppose bearing in mind how much we invest in this and how ambitious you are to eradicate it completely, and has it been quantified what the additional cost is on beef production, the whole area of disease control and particularly TB? And then just, I suppose, again on the transmission side, besides from comparing jurisdictions, I understand it's transmitted by airborne particles, animal to animal, human to human can be. Like how long after, say, a human being has been in contact with an infected herd or animal might, is it active, or can it be transmitted? Like how many days? And I'm just thinking if people are travelling and they've been to farms outside this jurisdiction. And just finally, I think Deputy Penrose made mention to the line, but at the end of your presentation, which was that obviously we can eradicate TB by 2030, but to do so will require some decisions that may be difficult for some in the short term. What are the difficult decisions, and for whom, and at what cost? And it sounds like an awful big undertaking to vaccinate all these badgers. I mean, what is the badger population in the country? What is the cost of it? I mean, what do you have to do? Do you have to actually physically catch all these badgers? That sounds like a massive, massive undertaking. I'm not trying to put you off doing it. I know it's your policy, but it's just what is the cost of that? And I think that's it. Thanks.
Thanks, Senator. Mr. Sheehan, back to you. Sorry, Senator Penrose or Limbard, sorry, had a brief question before we go back.
Yeah, sorry, just one thing I forgot. The amount of cases in coastal areas, have you found that there's an increase in the amount of cases in particularly some coastal districts? Take into consideration, I think your map is very broad. I would talk about places like maybe Corcoran, Barry Row, within 3 miles of the sea. There seems to be a very high issue of TB, but then they're not killing out in the factory itself. Is it more avian? Is it not related to actually the actual badger population? Slightly different, slightly off bat, but it is an issue out there.
Senator. Mr. Sheehan, sorry.
There was a lot of questions there now, so I'll answer some of them myself, and I'll ask my colleague Philip maybe to answer one or two, and I might ask my colleague Owen or Roseanne to deal with some of them. So, and if I forget some, you can pull me up on it. So, one of the questions that was asked was about live exports and the countries we send our live exports to. So, I suppose this is something that is always a concern to us, and as you'd be well aware, we export roughly 200,000 live cattle every year, roughly 100,000 calves, most of which go to Spain and the Netherlands. And not too long ago, the Netherlands had a significant outbreak of TB in calves they had imported from the UK. And the result was they imposed effectively a ban on the import of calves from the UK. Now, thankfully, that's something that, is a fear we would always have, that TB would be discovered in calves we've exported to Holland or whatever. Thankfully, it hasn't happened in recent years for a few reasons. Obviously, TB in calves in young animals is much less. It's a rare occurrence. And again, as you'll know, the calves we export to Netherlands and to a lesser extent to Spain, they're for the veal trade, so they're slaughtered at a very young age. Okay, so typically we haven't had issues with TB in any of our calf exports in recent years. Similarly, the bulk of the rest of our exports, our live exports to Turkey, our weaning exports to Italy and Spain and so on, again, typically these are animals for either for immediate slaughter or for going into feedlots and for slaughter within a couple of months. So simply from an age point of view, typically they're not the type of animals that develop TB. So they're slaughtered within a few months of arriving in Italy, 5 months or 6 months or whatever. And probably, and I'm not criticising the Italian system, but they don't have the same post-mortem regime in place as we do. Okay, so they're not, because they don't really have a significant TB problem, they don't have vets on the line looking for TB, slicing glands like we do. So, for better or for worse, we don't tend to get issues being notified to us from other countries in relation to TB, partly, as I say, because they're not looking, partly because the animals, the calves are being slaughtered at a very young age before they've had a chance to develop TB anyway. And in the case of the weanlings, again, they're being slaughtered at a relatively young age. So the country where we export older cattle to, breeding heifers, dairy stock, is the UK. And as you know, if we export to somewhere like Scotland, they're free of TB and they have post-import testing in place in relation to Irish cattle. It's a matter, certainly over the years we have had a number of notifications from the UK of animals that have been exported from Ireland which subsequently developed TB or whatever, and we follow up on all those. So in relation to the UK, TB in live exports is a bit of an issue. By and large, in other countries, in our bigger markets where we're sending cattle for slaughter or for the veal trade, it hasn't been an issue. That's the live exports. In relation to, what was the next thing? Again, just going back to the thing about, I think it was Deputy Lambert made the point, and I would agree with him, that there is still confusion out there. I think I mentioned this, our communications in relation to both the farmers and vets, there certainly is still confusion about exactly the value of the blood test, what the blood test is about, when it should be done and so on. So that's something we're working on. We've a whole communication strategy lined up where we will be doing things like producing short YouTube videos that we can send to farmers on their phones to explain exactly those type of things. Simple 2-minute video on, my animals, I had 3 reactors, but when I went to the factory there were no lesions. Does that mean they don't have TB? Of course, it doesn't mean that, but we want to explain why. The blood test, what's that about? So we've got a series of plans for short 2-minute videos to explain these kind of 10 common things that cause confusion amongst farmers and vets, in relation to TB. So I would agree, we have a job of work to do, and we're working on that and improving our communication in relation to all aspects of the TB programme, because there is a bit of confusion out there about certain aspects of it. What was the next thing? The thing about just going back over the point again about the marks and the putting stuff on the boards and marks or whatever, I think we probably dealt with that. That's something that's one of the things that's been discussed at the TB forum. There are 2 sides to the coin. There are pros and cons to making the information available is good for somebody who wants to buy and wants to keep their risk low, but it's not good from the point of view of somebody who has had a problem in their herd or whatever. So that's one of the Deputy Mulhern, or Senator Mulhern asked, what were the hard decisions? I suppose that's one of the key difficult decisions that the forum is grappling with, how to get over. We know that from a science point of view, if we had risk-based trading where the information was available to somebody when they were buying cattle as to the risk status of the herd they were buying from, we know that would lead us to eradication very, very quickly. And that's the policy that's been pursued now in a lot of other countries that still have TB problems. So in New Zealand, for example, risk-based trading is the norm now. So every herd is categorised. They have a simple categorisation system. So everybody knows what their category is, and nobody buys cattle without knowing what risk category herd they're buying from. So if you're in the highest risk category, you're only allowed to sell animals to somebody else who's in a high risk category. You're not allowed to sell animals to somebody who's in a low
In
disease
that
category.
scenario, Jean, would there be a compensation package in place
Not in New Zealand.
in New Zealand?
Do they have the same problem with badgers or contamination by?
They don't have a badger problem, they have a possum problem. So they have a wildlife problem similar to us, except it's a different wildlife
Are
species.
they vaccinating them?
Sorry? Oh yeah, and it's not a protected species, so they can shoot them without Berne Convention to worry about or whatever, you know. So, but yeah, so they've similar issues to ourselves. Yeah. I think Senator Mulhern asked about physically, is it not a big job to vaccinate the badgers? Yes, we have to physically catch them and inject them, and it is a big job. But we have so much information in relation to badger. We know literally where every single set in the country is at this stage. We have a map. We have the X and Y coordinates of them. We have teams in place around the country when it comes to culling. We have teams of department staff and farm relief staff. So we have a well-oiled machine in place at the moment in relation to culling of badgers. So the process in relation to vaccinating badgers is very similar. You capture them, but instead of shooting them, you vaccinate them and release them. You microchip them, vaccinate them and release them. And essentially, once they're vaccinated, the vaccine works very well in badgers, and essentially they're protected for, you know, it doesn't have to be repeated. They're protected for life, you know. So that's Senator Daly asked about a very good question about why is it if an animal gets TB in a herd, why don't they all get it? You know. So I might ask Philip, do you want to explain some of the genetic resistance and why some animals the infection only gets walled off within a certain part of the body and doesn't spread or may stay latent for many years or whatever?
Well, the thing about the bug that causes TB, Mycobacterium bovis, and all the mycobacteria is that they're quite unusual as bacteria. They're slow growing, first of all, so it can take up to 20 days for them to replicate, whereas like an E. coli that we're familiar with, especially in the water, and that can replicate in 20 minutes. And then there's a certain resistance. Some animals and sires through ICBF now have been identified in Ireland that confer more resistance to TB on their progeny than other sires, and that information is going to go into the EBVs in the new year. So there's a resistance issue then. So the immune system then is constantly in a battle with TB, and about half of all TB infections, the immune system conquers them for a period of time and they become latent. And this was especially recognised in people in TB, like 50% of the people in Ireland back in the 50s and 60s had some evidence of TB in their lungs, but it was walled off and it was no longer progressing. And there's along with that latency thing, where the immune system sort of stops it in its tracks for a period of time, that reduces the animal's chances then of being infective to other animals, okay? So you were asking, why is there a sporadic nature to some of the TB breakdowns? Well, first of all, there had to be a transmission point. It had to pick up the TB from somewhere. So if you get a lot of animals exposed to the same source, say a badger contaminates some feed or something like that, you could get a lot of animals infected from the wildlife source, whereas in a field grazing, you possibly might only get one or two. And then those cattle will have various levels of infectiousness to infect other cattle. So it can vary quite a bit in the numbers of animals. We do get some explosive breakdowns, and then thankfully most of our breakdowns, and increasingly as our TB situation has improved over the years, most of our breakdowns involve only one animal, one or two animals. And it's only 1/3 of our breakdowns involve 3 or more animals. And they're the higher risk ones, both in terms of spreading it onwards, back into badgers or back to other cattle. So getting back to why is there such variation? First of all, the transmission, and second of all, the behaviour of the bug with the animal's immune system. And in people, there are certain people that are recognised in TB in human medicine. There's this concept of the super shedder. Some people have managed to infect way more people with TB than most people that get infected. And it is thought that the same phenomenon exists both in the badger and the bovine population as well, that there are some super shedders.
Through the chair, just briefly, you said that you can now identify sires who will breed a bloodline that are more resilient.
Yeah.
Have you the opposite information as to bloodlines that are more susceptible?
Well, there'll be the EBVs for a lot of different traits go from, you know, high to low, and the resistance for TB will be on a scale as well, most resistant to the least resistant, and that'll be part of, you know, they have the traits for fertility and for milk yield, and then on the suckler side for carcass conformation and things like that. So this will be another trait that will be available for people to use. So the research on that was just completed this year and published, and we've signed a data sharing agreement with ICBF, and the new values will be available early next year.
Okay.
So, just to pick up on a few of the other questions, so don't forget them. Senator Lombard asked about coastal areas. So no, in fact, we don't have any particular evidence to support the theory that there's a bigger problem in coastal areas. In fact, if you look at the map of where our problems are, in fact, you know, in general, our coastal areas are the greenest, you know, but that's not to say that there couldn't be some specific issue in Corcoran or wherever it was you mentioned. But in general, no, we don't find that there's any association with coastal areas. In fact, I'd say possibly the opposite. You know, the coastal areas have less problems. You also asked about, you know, is there a standardised protocol in relation to the use of gamma interferon and so on? So yes, I would say it's probably fair to say that if you went back a couple of years, we probably hadn't our approach as we have 16 offices around the country, and we probably hadn't our approach as standardised as we might like, but that's certainly something we've addressed in recent years. So now when it comes to whether you're in Donegal or Corcoran or wherever, the approach, if your herd is unfortunate enough to have a TB problem, the approach should be identical or as near identical as humanly possible. So there's a standardised approach to when gamma interferon is used, when a contiguous programme is initiated, and so on and so forth. So there were two other questions. One in relation, it's going back to communications. I might ask my colleague Roseanne, who I suppose is the one who's spearheading our efforts to improve our communication. I might ask Roseanne to say a few words on that. And then I think, again, it was probably Senator Lombard asked the question about the removal time for reactors. I might ask my colleague Colm, who you have the facts and figures on removal time. So maybe, Roseanne, do you want to just mention a little bit on our efforts to improve our communications?
Obviously, as you've stated, an awful lot of our communications are focused on the people who have TB, but more and more we're recognising that we need to look to the 97% who don't have TB and advise them as to how they can reduce their risks of contracting TB in their herd. So a number of things that we've committed to doing over the next couple of years. I think Michael has mentioned it already, producing a number of small short videos, for instance, on issues such as biosecurity, how to make your farm more biosecure to avoid the spread of TB to your herd, issues around wildlife, badgers, etc., fencing off badger sets, issues in relation to purchasing of animals, maybe animals in your herd, etc. Do you need to look at the older animals in your herd? So again, putting much more focus on the herds who don't have TB at the moment, as well as those that do. In addition to that, we are hoping to produce a number of leaflets which will complement the videos. There's very little information out there available publicly unless you go onto our website. So we're hoping to produce some small, colourful leaflets explaining the different types of TB tests that are out there, what they mean, what the results mean, etc. Again, a lot of them would be focused on herds that have TB. I have reactors, but they don't kill out with lesions. Why is that, etc. But again, highlighting the biosecurity issues, what you can do to protect your herd if you don't currently have TB in your herd. Now, as well as that, we're also reviewing all the letters we send out to farmers. Again, the annual round test letter goes out to all farmers in the country. It doesn't just go out to the herds infected with TB. And last year, we revamped that letter into a kind of very simple do's and don't type information leaflet, which we hope is a vast improvement on what went before. And as I say, we're reviewing all our other letters that are going out to farmers to try and make them more farmer friendly, get the message across more clearly, and get hopefully give more advice to people on what they can do to protect their herds. So they're just some of the things we're doing in the next couple of years. So.
Thank you. Okay. Colin.
Sorry, just on the communications, I might add as well that up to last year, if you wanted to find out about our TB eradication programme, the only available information really on our website was our submission to the EU for co-funding, which ran into the guts of 100 pages and was a very dense, full of technical language that wouldn't be understandable to the average person. And Roseanne's team developed, we have this, which we can provide copies to members of the committee if you like. It's a 20-page document in very friendly, common language that gives a kind of a high-level explanation of how the programme works and what we try to do. Separately then, on the reactor removal times, again, this is an issue that comes up constantly with our stakeholders around the country. Ideally, we would get our reactors off the farm as soon as they're identified. The major issue as to why it takes a protracted period of time is to allow for an independent valuation system, which is, I think, relatively unique to Ireland. For example, other areas in the UK provide a book valuation, so if you're unfortunate enough to suffer a breakdown, you'll be told over the phone, this is the type of animal you have, this is the value you're going to get for that animal, that's it, and then they can remove the reactor. In Ireland, if you are unfortunate enough to suffer a breakdown, the local office will give you a call and tell you, here's the valuers who operate in your county, and then there's a number of days which allow that valuer to go out to your farm, look at the animals, then they go back, take account of all the paperwork, then send you a valuation by post. The farmer then has 3 or 4 days to consider that valuation and make a decision. So there's a level of kind of to and fro to allow for that valuation process, and there's also a system which allows for a second appeal valuation if people are unhappy with the valuation. So I suppose all of that process means that the average reactor removal time runs over to about 20 days. And we are very keen to reduce that time frame as much as possible. You mentioned whether we had any particular commitments in that, and we do. There is a commitment for the department to remove reactors within 10 days after all documentation has been signed off by the farmer and the department in terms of the valuation process. And that currently, we've again working to reduce that. That's down to about 5 days. So we report on that, is it monthly or quarterly, to the Farmers' Charter, which meets in Portlaoise. One of the key things that we've done to try to reduce reactor removal times, I think Michael mentioned earlier, our gamma interferon policy. So in breakdowns where you have 3 or more reactors, there will then be follow-up blood testing to try and see if there's any more infection in the herd. And I suppose prior to last year, the standard practice was, from public service, supposed to try and drive efficiency for value for money for the taxpayer, was to wait until all reactors had been identified and then collect all the reactors together, the ones that had been initially identified through the skin test, and then the ones separately that had been identified through the blood test. The policy which we have now pushed out to all of our regional offices is that as soon as the skin test reactors have been identified, go and collect those reactors, and if there's subsequent reactors in a blood test, we'll go and collect those subsequently. So the focus is very much on disease eradication. So that has helped to bring down the reactor removal timeframe significantly. And so what we're doing to facilitate that is the haulier contracts we have to collect reactors. We're having far more reactor or hauliers and smaller ones. So it could be a Jeep or a pickup truck as opposed to, say, a lorry that will only go and collect 10 or 20 reactors in a locality to justify the trip. So that's what we're trying to do on reactor removal times. But we've also said to all stakeholders that we're absolutely open to any other proposals which will help us to reduce that timeline further, because you're absolutely correct. We want to get that reactor off the farm as quickly as possible from a disease perspective.
So the average at the moment is 20 days?
It's about 20 days. I think it could have dipped under that to 19 point something, yeah. And then about 5.5 days, I think, from when all documentation is signed off.
One of the issues that I came across through that was the lack of capacity in the factories on certain occasions to take it. Did you find how many factories in Ireland actually slaughter reactors, and do you find a capacity issue at times as an issue?
At present, we're confident that we have enough capacity in the system for culling of reactors, and it's an issue that we'd keep an eye on consistently, just to make sure that, as you say, doesn't represent an issue for us. But at the moment, we're satisfied that there's enough capacity and that's not causing a...
How many factories slaughter?
There's about 4 or 5, I think, about that number.
Okay.
Okay. There was a couple of other... Sorry.
Mr. Chairman, Northern Ireland and the level of TB in Northern Ireland, the regulations that are trained there.
Yeah. So, yeah, great. So yeah, I mean, it is a concern that our colleagues in Northern Ireland are facing a significant challenge there, and that Northern Irish farmers have a very serious problem with TB that's affecting them every day. The levels of TB in Northern Ireland are far higher than ours. They're getting just shy of 10%. We're just shy of 3.5% here, about 3.4%. The main difference between the programmes, I suppose, is that we have had a badger control, a wildlife control programme. We've been culling badgers and now we're vaccinating badgers. And for, I suppose, political reasons, social reasons, maybe that policy wasn't acceptable in that in Northern Ireland, and they weren't able to go down that path. We have very close relationships and we work very closely with our northern colleagues. So as Mr. Sheehan mentioned just yesterday, we spent a day at a full day meeting with our northern colleagues who we meet regularly and we work very closely with. We coordinate on things like outbreaks near the border, and we're continually working to try and improve communication on cross-border issues. They have a programme based on the European regulations, the same as ours, so it's very closely aligned to our programme. Now, there are some small differences in how it's applied, but substantially it's more or less very similar, other than the fact that they don't have a wildlife control programme. Also, they carry out gamma blood testing, but it's not compulsory to remove positives. So if you have an animal that tests positive on the gamma blood test, you don't actually have to remove it. Now, they've recently carried out a substantial review of their TB strategy in Northern Ireland. They had an expert stakeholders group that reviewed their programme and came up with some proposals, and they now have a TB eradication partnership. They invited actually myself and Philip up there to speak to them a few weeks ago about our programme, and they're renewing their whole strategy. And a key element of that, they want to bring in badger controls, so wildlife removals, and also they want to carry out vaccination where appropriate. They also want to take steps in relation to things like the levels of compensation, which in Northern Ireland they have a different context there. They feel the levels of compensation are too high. They had a Northern Ireland Audit Office carried out a review recently along the same lines, and they found that it was the consideration was that they didn't feel it was good value for money, that what they were getting for the state expenditure. Their levels have crept upwards. I think they're stabilising in the last year or so, but certainly they have a significant challenge, and that's a challenge for us because it just is the case. I mean, as you made the point, we share a border with them, and there is trade. Now, any export animals have to be tested before they can be exported, so that's less of a concern. But certainly, wildlife don't respect borders, and it's something that we're very aware of and conscious of ourselves. So we are always keen to work with and collaborate and support our northern colleagues where we can. We regularly have technical visits from their teams come down here, our teams might go up there, because if we can do something to assist them in any way we can, we're keen to do so. And similarly, we have to say we've had very good assistance from them where necessary, where appropriate. But I agree with the point you're making. It's not a good situation. They'd be the first to acknowledge that. And I think the fact that they have had these very significant reviews come out in the last few months saying they really need to change things, that speaks to that. Unfortunately, there are political problems up there. They don't have a minister, they don't have a devolved government in place, and the substantial decisions cannot be taken until those things are in place. So it's a challenge.
Okay, there's a couple of other questions there before I bring in Deputy O'Keefe. Senator Mulhern had a couple of questions regards the cattle rustling, the issue of, she was wondering, did you find the source of the problem in Monaghan and the regimes in other countries?
In relation to cattle rustling, no. I mean, the numbers of cattle stolen are, relatively small in the grand scale of things. So no, we haven't. We're not aware of that being a particular risk factor in any of our outbreaks. Not that we know of, anyway. As regards the cause of the problems in County Monaghan, as I say, for a number of years, Monaghan was around the national average in terms of the level of disease, and then there was a sort of I won't say an explosion, but certainly the disease, it crept up and then it sort of went up dramatically over the course of a couple of years. We haven't put it down to one particular factor, but TB is like that. It's not a disease where there's just one factor. It's not just a question of it's badgers or it's deer or it's it's quality of testing or whatever. It's a number of factors. So, I mean, Monaghan has a few issues. I mean, the farms tend to be very, very fragmented there. There is the Northern Ireland element, maybe somewhat of a factor, but other than that, I suppose probably like in other parts of the country, for a number of years, I suppose we had an embargo on recruitment of staff and stuff like that. So possibly in some of our offices we had less staff than we might have liked to actually deal with issues. So, no, we don't have a particular one single thing that we can put our finger on and say that's what caused the graph to go up. No more than with the outbreak in Kerry at the start of last year. There wasn't one particular factor. We probably never know. I mean, all it might take to cause a problem in an area is for one infected animal to be bought in that's not showing signs, that has passed the test, is not showing signs of the disease, goes into a herd, is stressed in some way and becomes a super shedder and sheds huge volumes of infected bacteria, infects a large number of cattle in that herd, and again, before those animals have been tested, they're sold to neighbouring herds or whatever. It's as simple as that. A couple of heavily infected animals that haven't been detected in the test can do a lot of damage before you actually get on top of the problem. So, but again, our experience has shown in Kerry, even though we never actually were able to put our finger on what was the cause of the problem, once we put an intensified programme in place, it clamps down on the disease and the graph comes down very, very quickly. So we expect that's what will happen in Monaghan. I'll be very surprised if this time next year the graph hasn't come down very significantly. So, sorry, what was it? Was there a third question?
The other question was the regime in other countries.
All right.
Like Argentina, Brazil, where we're competing in a market, we must sell.
Sorry?
No compensation.
Yeah. Do you want to talk on that? Or, I mean, I suppose just within the EU, I suppose the reality is most countries don't have TB. Most countries that would have had TB back in the 50s and 60s, they put eradication programs in place. They didn't have the complications of a wildlife issue at the time, so their programs in general were successful. So the only countries that have within the EU that have significant problems are ourselves, England, Wales, Northern Ireland. Spain have some problems, but not to anything like the same extent. Italy have some problems, and France have some minor problems. And outside of that, by and large, it's not particularly a problem within the EU. In relation to, do you know much about Argentina?
Much, maybe just as a point of information. So, as Mike said, we operate within the EU context, but in most of the developing world, TB is endemic and is very serious, and it's a huge problem when anybody who's worked in those countries to be aware. Argentina and Brazil control TB in their beef production herds just through test and slaughter without compensation. So there's much less of a social, I suppose, support there for it. They don't have the cap and that sort of thing. And of course, that's one of the reasons that they produce beef at a lower cost. That these huge farms, and when they do have positives, they just slaughter them. So their program wouldn't be analogous to us in the same level. It's more protecting the production, because I suppose one of the elements with TB is that we're lucky here that we no longer really have substantial direct production losses to TB. There are a small number of animals in the country that get actual tuberculosis and wane away and die, but it's not common. But in other countries, it is still and it used to be a big problem in Ireland. It was a substantial production loss. So that's where they're at. They're not looking at TB eradication. They're looking at reducing the production losses. And if they have positives, they're just they're slaughtered. I suppose.
You mentioned that it's not comparable, but how effective is it at the end of the day?
Well, I'd say it's substantially less effective than what we're doing, because one of the things that's critical with these things is to have a stakeholder buy-in and to look at all the risks. So even if you had buy-in from the big, large beef herds, there's still the smaller ones who mightn't feel like, I wouldn't feel like cooperating with the programme if I got no compensation if my animals were to be slaughtered. I think one of the ways in which, as Mike said, we're aware that we're within an international context. We do support links with our international colleagues on it, and in fact there's going to be large meeting in Galway in 2020, which we're assisting the organisation of. The last one was in Wales in 2014, where all the TB programme managers from across the world come to discuss these sort of issues. So obviously the particular areas that are of relevance to ourselves, the Welsh, the English, the Northern Irish and the French, wouldn't be quite the same as those for other countries, but there's also large areas of crossover, and this is one of the ways that we're continually trying to make sure that we're aligned with the international best practice, what the latest research says. And it's also important to build those international links because, for instance, Canada and the United States are free of TB. We want to make sure that that doesn't come up with any of our trade deals there. China can be a concern with Australians and New Zealanders. So it's important to keep these links up. So I can provide very limited information on Argentina and Brazil, but we do exist in an international context, and people do often say, well, what's your TB situation if they're looking at animals or animal products? So, as important it is, I suppose it's very important to engage internally with our own stakeholders and our own farming organisations and farmers, but we also want to stay aware of our colleagues internationally, not just because it's nice to know what's going on, but also actually it has a direct relevance to making sure people have confidence in our trade when we say you can believe our programme works. Well, they actually know us and they've faith it works. So that's one of the other ways we're addressing that.
Deputy O'Keefe, I know you were late coming now. I'll give you an opportunity, a couple of questions.
Chair, thank you very much, Chair. And I suppose, first of all, I have been monitoring most of the deliberations on the monitor, and hopefully that if I do ask questions that have been asked already, you can rule me out of order. Okay, I'll accept that, right? Chair, the first item, and I welcome the officials here today. Just wondering, in the last 5 months, 6 months, following the severe drought period we had, would the department have noticed a spike in the increase of TB arising in places where farming practices have changed in such a way that farmers end up feeding out in the fields, as opposed to dropping the meal out in the fields and the mixture out in the fields for the livestock? Would you have noticed any in those areas? Obviously they do a background search and research on farms that pick up the TB. Would you have noticed if these farms have changed their practice in the last 6 months in regards to how they feed their livestock? The big issue, Chair, that comes across to me is the compensation issue. I suppose it is all fine if you have the cow or the milk going to the creamery, but you have a lot of beef farmers and, for that matter, maybe suckling farmers who get locked up and incur phenomenal costs. And the compensation at the end of the day is for the size and the weight of the livestock unit. But no matter how big prices go, there's still costs involved in paying for this farm management operation, and some farms have to carry their stock extra long periods if they get locked up a second time, and the compensation thing is becoming a big issue, and that's incorporating labour costs as well. Just on a trivial point, I heard there mention about you were in Wicklow, and you were saying about the different types of deer, what deer get. Obviously there must be different breeds of deer in Wicklow, and about which ones get the TB more than others. Does that arise in regards our livestock, say the different types of milk and lactation cows we have in our farms? Would you see a prevalence in different breeds, pick up TB easier than others? Is that happening? And finally, but I suppose as my colleagues have told me, we have the TB forum, which we welcome, but do you see yourselves going down the route of all-out blood testing as opposed to under the skin sensitivity? Because from what I can see, and why I'm asking these questions, Chair, is in my own backyard, I've seen herds going down not in single numbers, in double digits, and phenomenal TB in the recently, so I just wondering what's happening, what's causing all this, in an area that I thought was cleared.
Thanks, Andy. Sheen then, please.
Obviously there's no repetition, is there?
No, you're not too bad.
Not too bad. You come up with a few good new ones as well, So in relation to the drought, and obviously that had a big impact in lots of parts of the country. No, certainly so far we haven't seen any pattern that would link change in behaviour to problems in an area or whatever, But I suppose it's something that often with TB, it's only when you look back after 12 months or 18 months that you might see a pattern. But so far, no, we haven't seen any pattern in relation to meal feeding, changing the levels of TB in an area, So certainly not yet, anyway. in relation to, you asked about deer and then, you know, is there a difference between different breeds of cattle and so on? Yeah, we kind of touched on that earlier. I suppose in recent times there has been quite a bit of work done in relation to genetic resistance, you know, and so there now is, we can now say, or ICBF can now tell us particular bulls, you know, tend to be more resistant, particular lines tend to be more resistant to TB than other lines, you know, so that's something that ICBF are, you know, have done a lot of work, and others have done work, and so I think over the next couple of years that's probably something that will become a bigger issue in relation to part of the tools we use to tackle TB. As regards specific breeds, I don't think I don't think we would say that Herefords are more susceptible than Aberdeen Angus or anything like that. We haven't any particular evidence of that, but certainly genetics is an issue. Sorry, Owen, do you want to?
Well, just to say briefly, that first of all, this was an example of great research done by Teagasc, and you know, we were talking a lot earlier that, you know, we want what we're doing to be driven by the data and the research, and we've gotten great value from the research, and there's some really top-class Irish researchers working on this. This is an example where Teagasc did great work, and that one of the outputs from it was there is more variation between breeds than between them than within them. In other words, within breeds than between them. In other words, the difference of the bull is much more important than the difference between a Holstein or a Hereford or a Limousine. So that was an important question because, you know, it does arise, are Limousines or Charlies more likely to, and their output was, well, actually, it's the bull drives it much more than breed variation. So just to clarify that, the difference is bull rather than between breeds. It's not really a particular breed.
Okay. In relation to the compensation issue, yeah, as you say, compensation is becoming a bigger issue. In fact, from our point of view, while it's something that, you know, people complain, you know, the farming organisations will often make an issue of compensation. In practice, what we find is that our valuation system works very, very well. So if a farmer isn't happy with the valuation he gets, he has the, you know, he can appeal. There's a second valuation will be done, but the numbers that appeal are actually very low. So roughly, I think, is it 3%? Roughly 3% of all valuations are appealed, half by ourselves and half by the farmer. So it's a very, very low level of appeal, you know, and certainly when you talk privately to most farmers, I mean, maybe farmers are never happy with the price they get at the mart or whatever, but by and large, our experience is that the valuation system is pretty fair. Now,
I'm not about when the animal that's detected is being valued. I'm on about the person's locked up in.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Carry over.
So I mean, yeah. So Ireland is probably the only country in the world that we know that actually gives compensation above and beyond the valuation of the animal. So we have a hardship grant, which is a small amount of money to, you know, tide certain categories of farmers over the winter period if they're forced to keep extra staff, and we have income supplement. So as we're the only country possibly in the world that actually has those systems, they certainly do not, and they're not designed to compensate somebody fully for every single loss of every gallon of milk or every, you know, every kilo of meat or whatever. But they're unique. They're unique to Ireland. So.
With respect, is more the salvage value of the animal, not over the value of the animal.
I mean, the salvage value has no impact on the farmer. Because
yeah, but you said the full value of the animal with respect isn't paid with the live valuation, in my view. If you have a good dairy cow on second lactation, and you have misfortune enough to have her go down in September or October, you definitely don't get the value of that animal.
Yeah. Well, I suppose the evidence would suggest otherwise. You know, the valuations. You know, if the valuations are based on what the market value of that animal would be if it didn't have TB. In other words, if it was sold, if it was a second lactation cow that was sold in a clearance sale or whatever it was, the valuation is designed to reflect what that animal would make if it didn't have TB. Okay.
We'll be here a long time arguing this one. We won't get agreement on that. No.
A very small number of people appeal the valuation, and we appeal when we feel the valuation has been too generous or hasn't been accurate. We will appeal a small number. You know, so that's so in practice we find that while it's an issue that's raised, it's not as big an issue maybe as some might have you believe. And I think the other question then that was asked about blood testing, yeah. So again, this was probably covered earlier. I think the question you were asking was, will we be using all-out blood testing instead of skin testing, if I understood correctly? So no, the reason that we can't do that or wouldn't do that is because while the blood test has a lot of advantages, it also has a higher level of false positives. You know, about if you tested 100 cattle, you'd get 3 false positives. So it's not a test you could use in the general population of 6 million cattle, because you'd end up with too many false positives. So we only use it in herds where we know there is a problem, and we go in and we use it in addition to the skin test. And then it has the advantage, it picks out infected animals that the skin test hasn't picked up, and it picks them up at an earlier stage. So it's a very useful extra tool in infected herds, but it's not a tool to use in the wider population, because you'd end up with way too many false positives being taken out.
And the consequential last issue, like, you know, take a farmer who carries stores and usually lets them off in the autumn, right? But he's locked up before the month of October, November will come before he goes to the mat with him. He's locked up. He's cycling now, obviously he's upset, like, you know, but he's carrying stock into the winter. Extra feed, extra costs. You're not into that type of farming, and it's like, you know, that's the last I'm on about, you know, and there's no good he going to the bank, like, you know, and looking for more money, like, you know, and listen, Chair, going down the road, he could be caught under no climatic change rules, like, in regards to stocking as well, like, you know. So what's been put in place for those kind of people, like, you know?
Yeah. So yeah, look. So again, I'm not trying to say that when somebody's locked up with TB that it's hassle-free. It's not. Obviously, it's the last thing anybody wants, you know. And so there are, at certain times of the year in particular, it does make life very, very awkward, putting it mildly, for a sector that's already not the most profitable business in the world. Suckler farming or beef farming, the Teagasc figures will show you, is not a profitable business in the first place, you know. So having the added burden of being locked up, absolutely. I mean, that's the reason why we want to do everything we can to get rid of TB as quickly as possible, and that's why we're committed to trying to work with everyone to get it done by 2030, and in certain parts of the country even before that, you know. So yeah, absolutely. I wouldn't try to pretend it's not a hardship. It is, you know. And the compensation, the income supplement and the hardship grant are designed to help to alleviate some of the difficulty associated with that.
Just a final question before I wrap up. The cost so far to the state, what has it been? Yeah, sorry, Deputy.
So, I mean,
I had a note here. I don't know. I know I wanted to keep it for last.
Okay, so I mean, the cost in today's terms.
I know we'll be here if I'm alive.
All right, Deputy.
Roughly, the scheme in total at the moment is costing about 85 million.
No, from the beginning, I wanted to find out.
From the billions. Do we have a figure? I might ask colleagues.
No, annually, from the 50s.
1956.
So if we use 85 million, as Michael suggested for last year, if we use that as a ballpark for back to 1954, that would equate in today's money of about €5.5 billion.
5.5 billion euros.
Yes, and if we keep going at the rate we're going,
I'd say no.
I would probably think so, because we've already outlined we're at a far lower level of disease incidence now than we were previously. And then if we estimate if we keep spending at our current rate to 2030, that's another €1 billion. So that's why we feel there's a significant urgency to try and get everyone around the table to try and eradicate it as quickly as possible.
You owe the Irish public to do your best at that money. They do an awful lot of other work.
That's why we're all in green.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
I suppose just to make the point, I suppose that's the reason why, when it comes to, you know, as I said, there are some difficult decisions to be made in relation to risk-based trading and so on and so forth. And I suppose, you know, the prize is that if we eradicate TB by 2030 or sooner, you know, it's going to be a huge cost saving for farmers who are carrying the bulk of the burden, and for the taxpayer who's carrying the rest of the burden. So I suppose that's why we are so keen to try and get everybody, try and get a consensus amongst people, even to make some of those decisions which are difficult in the short term for a small number of individuals, but the prize is huge, and the prize is achievable.
Thanks very much, Member and witnesses, for attending here today. I think it's been a very informative session today. I'd like to thank Mr. Sheehan, Mr. Breslin, Ms. Green, Mr. Ryan and Mr. Ford for attending here today. I think it's something that we'll probably hear more about in due course, and we have to suspend briefly now for our next part of the meeting. So thank you very much again. Okay, I'd like to welcome Professor Jerry O'Boyle, Director of Tagus. Thank him for coming before the committee today to discuss Tagus annual report for 2017. Before we begin, I want to bring to your attention witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of the evidence given to the committee. However, if you're directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you are entitled thereafter to qualify a privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed to only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings to be giving, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary capacity of the effect of where possible. You should not criticise or make charge against any person or entity by name in such ways to make him or her identifiable. Members are reminded of long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that members should not comment on, criticise or make charge against either person outside the House or an official either by name in such ways to make him or her identifiable. Professor O'Boyle, now I ask you to make your opening statement, please. Are you ready?
Thanks, Cahill. Look, I welcome this opportunity to...
Sorry, first of all, apologies for keeping you waiting.
No, not to worry. I've got plenty of work done. Thanks, Chairman. I welcome the opportunity to present this opening statement to the committee. If it's okay with you, Cahill, look, I don't propose to read out the entire document in the interest of time. So, okay. So I think I'll start with page 2 there, just listing out the various programmes. Teagasc has 6 programmes there set out there on the top of the page, and they include animal grassland, food, crops, environment and land use, rural economy, advisory and education. And the committee probably knows we have 51 advisory offices around the country. That's down from 90 following the rationalisation programme. We have 4 colleges of further education and 7 research centres, and we also subvent 3 what we call private colleges in Pallaskenry, Mount Bellew and Gortine. In relation to our finances, last year I think our total expenditure was approximately 187 million. We are obliged every year to match expenditure with income. I would draw the committee's attention to a somewhat unique feature of Teagasc as a non-commercial body, in that we have a relatively large amount of what I call non-grant and aid income, which amounted to about 56 million in 2017. That basically comprises various grants that Teagasc receives as a result of success in competitions for research, and advisory funds both at national and EU level. We also, of course, benefit from advisory fees paid by farmers and education fees. We have significant farm operations, a small amount of levies from industry, and we sell a variety of professional services. In 2017, we received 125 million euro in grant and aid for current expenditure purposes, and a further capital grant of 3.15 million. Again, I'm to also draw your attention to the fact that we also, again, unlike many other public bodies, part of our grant and aid is used to defray the cost of pensions. And we have a large number of pensioners at this stage, given the age of the organisation. The total pension bill amounted to 43 million in 2017. If pension costs were excluded from current expenditure, then the non-grant and aid income was about 45% of the 2017 level of current expenditure. If I now turn to page 3 there, to the heading entitled Performance Metrics. As a public body, we are obliged to operate a rigorous performance and evaluation system. That's several layers, but for example, we conduct external peer reviews of all of our programmes, including our administrative programmes, on a regular basis, and we monitor and track key performance indicators across the organisation. And again, I won't go into this in detail, but I've set out in the appendices there. I guess this is the bottom line for us as a non-commercial body. We look at performance in terms of, on the research side, how internationally competitive we are in regard to publications, also in relation to securing external funding for our research. And you can see there's a healthy trend shown. On the advisory side, We have about in and around 43,000 clients. It fluctuates a little bit from year to year. And they paid Teagasc close to 12 million, or paid Teagasc close to 12 million in advisory charges in 2017. And we've about, I think it's about 5 million or so from education fees. We conduct, in terms of communicating knowledge, we engage in several activities such as open days, farm walks, conferences, media communications, increasingly through the use of social media. And all of these channels are, of course, freely available to all interested parties. We also operate a highly successful fellowship programme for the training of PhDs. At present, we have the single largest group of students studying for PhD level in a single subject area, about 250 students at present. And these are all undertaken in partnership arrangements with national and international universities and research agencies. I should add, Chairman, and I'd like to put in my opening statement, we also have about 20 MSc students in a collaboration with UCD for the training of knowledge transfer or advisory specialists. And finally, just draw your attention to the various trends in enrolments at Teagasc colleges and at regional offices through our part-time programmes. From 2008 up till very recently, the numbers exploded really in our agricultural colleges. I think going back to about 2014 or so, the increase in 2008 had been something like 250% in enrolments in year one. When the economy began to pick up again, these enrolments have fallen back in colleges, especially for what we call the further education students. As you're probably aware, Chairman, we partner with a number of institutes of technology in the delivery of degree programmes and also with University College Dublin in the delivery of higher education programmes. Enrolments in the higher education courses have been fairly stable. And following the various incentives for young farmers to re-enter education enshrined in the Rural Development Programme of the CAP, there has been a substantial increase in enrolments in part-time and distance education courses. In fact, Chairman, enrolments are now running at over 3 times the level that prevailed prior to the RDP measures, and the demand continues to be exceptionally strong, particularly in the northeast of the country and north of the country. Finally, Chairman, just to conclude, I'd like to make a few comments on financial management as they were raised in our annual report. Just to bring to the attention of the committee, in the absence of access to borrowing facilities, Teagasc in recent years has faced significant challenges in funding working capital requirements. This issue has become more acute as our non-grant and aid income has increased significantly, and we mightn't always get paid promptly. And we have to finance that while we're waiting for payment, finance the capital involved. Similarly, in the absence of a borrowing facility, longer-term capital funding for research and educational infrastructure is even more challenging. Our grant and aid typically earmarks a relatively small amount of funding for infrastructural purposes, which is only really sufficient to partially cover maintenance costs and some minor capital works. As I've instanced earlier, last year, for example, the capital allocation was €3.15 million. More substantial infrastructural needs are funded as the opportunity arises through the sale of assets that are no longer programme priorities or through once-off special capital grants from government. Reliance on asset sales as a funding mechanism is not a sustainable basis on which to fund ongoing infrastructural needs, and while we're always appreciative of special capital grants, the process does result in an episodic funding schedule. This approach inhibits Teagasc's ability to meet its strategic investment needs on a planned and timely basis, and especially our ability to respond rapidly to changing needs. For example, climate change would be an example. Our ability to respond is curtailed. So it's not really possible to commit to a medium-term investment plan as grant-based funding requests have been progressed on a case-by-case basis. Access to longer-term investment funding would be a highly welcome innovation. I have to say, though, Chairman, we do make our case, and from time to time, such as the budget 12 months ago, we got a significant capital allocation that we have been looking for a number of years for a food innovation hub. And finally, Chairman, there is mention in the Statement of Internal Control to procurement issues and difficulties that we faced. We're making every effort, I want to assure the committee, to be as compliant as possible in regards to procurement practices. Significant improvements can be reported in recent years through the recruitment of specialist staff and through the establishment of robust systems of control. It's complex in Teagasc due to the diversified range of activities and also the fact that we're dispersed across the country on several locations. The exceptions reported in the financial statements were brought to the attention of Teagasc itself by the CNAG, and there are really two reasons why they occurred, neither satisfactory, but nonetheless I thought it was important to draw them to your attention. Quotes were sought from a number of local suppliers rather than advertising through e-tenders, as was strictly required for the amounts involved. We are nonetheless quite satisfied that this did not adversely affect value for money, given the number of quotes that were sought and the type of services procured. Also, extension of existing contracts where the requirement was being reviewed, where there were delays in the implementation of the Office of Government Procurement process, or where a similar service had already been procured from that supplier. While I want to stress, Chairman, that no exceptions can be tolerated, it should be noted that the exceptions amounted to tender values of €1.35 million out of a total amount of transactions of 42 million, representing a little over 3%. Thank you, Chairman.
Well, I have three questions lined up. First of all, Senator Daly, Deputy Penrose and Deputy Cahill. First of all, in their order, please.
Just briefly, Chairman, I want to welcome Professor Boyle here this evening. You made no reference there to the area of farm safety, and I'd like maybe if you could elaborate on the percentage of your budget and expenditure that goes towards that area, and what your role within the whole farm safety system and setup is, and how you think that should be performed going forward to try and reduce the statistics of the numbers of accidents and indeed the number of fatalities, which don't seem to be decreasing in any manner. So you said at the outset that your report was based basically on an analysis of your performance in that particular area. I don't think you could be happy with the analysis performance based, and what you're spending on it, how many dedicated people you have, what your official role within the whole farm safety sphere is, and how you think it could be improved going forward to meet the challenges.
Senator Deputy Penrose, please.
Thanks to Professor Boyle for a succinct presentation. It's very useful and a good harbinger of the rest of the people who should appear here should do the same. In relation to the Food Innovation Hub at Moore Park, Professor Boyle, could you give an outline of how that thing's going? I think there's a public-private aspect to that in relation to research and development, and how that is, going as a part of the Food Innovation Hub that you're involved in. In relation to this farm safety, like Senator Daly, obviously, there's 24, 25 deaths annually now. It's far too many, and unfortunately, notwithstanding a significant focus on it in recent years, between yourselves and Dr. John McNamara, who used to be involved in it a lot with yourselves, and the Health and Safety Authority. Can you outline what you're doing in relation to I suppose, trying to bring in place the code of practice that's preventing injuries in that regard? I note in relation to procurement, but I salute you in trying to ensure that, because Teagasc is not a kind of a homogeneous organisation. It's a lot of diverse activities there, so it's very difficult to stick to the various procurement procedures that are laid down, and it's a very minuscule aspect of same. So in terms of the exceptions, so I think that sometimes Teagasc has to act with great alacrity to ensure that they can continue the various programmes. I want to ask you in relation to it's something that I've been raising over the years, and you probably know that I'm going to raise it about the Greenfield Farm. You know, because I mean that's an issue that I certainly pursued here. I know you have an independent report with Dr. Morden, Tom Morden, former Secretary General here. But that's to me, you know, it's a bit of a blight, I might say so, Professor Boyle, in relation to the overall activities of Teagasc and indeed the partners. And I indicated initially I knew there was more mortalities than what was initially reported in terms of cows and calves, and sure there was bound to be. You know, and surely, you know, I mean, even if you read the report, and as a demonstration farm, it wasn't certainly, it was not a very good example in terms of the situation that arose, the operability of it, and indeed the advisability of having cows and calves in those, outdoor facilities. You know, these climatic events are going to be quite regular now. And there's no excuse for this to ever happen again, and I would hope that we'd never have to revisit it again. I was greatly annoyed, and indeed a number of people, including from members of the farming public, contacted me over this, no later than about a month ago. Some farmers, even from Wicklow, were very, very annoyed because, it was clearly a vulnerable system. I mean, this is all right in New Zealand and other places, but not here, and we should have. I mean, I'm being critical. There was a lack of safety statements and anticipatory plans. There was a lack of risk assessment, lack of hazard analysis. Nothing appears to be done. It's now pointed out that this has to be done, and that the independent review does point to a failure of management. You know, and at times and in relation to the situation, and you know, I think myself, there appears to have been even a reference there to adequate food reserves. There's references in it, so I mean, you know, we can't bury those. Those are there, and it's not just the mortality of animals. Where we had cows and calves. And those things happen. There are instances, I mean, we're not fools. Those happen in relation to ordinary farming. But when you expose them to the elements, and there's the stress and everything else that arises from that exposure. Everywhere else, you had farmers running all over the place, trying to bring animals in, and even in sheds that may not have been the best. They were trying to make do and trying to put in place during that particular period. Now, I know there were unusual climatic events. But we have to cut out this nonsense now of saying that this is a rarity. This looks to be going to be commonplace now, and so I certainly will be keeping an eye on this. And if we have to come back here in next March or April again, Chairperson, I would certainly, someone will have to be brought to book. And I'd ask Professor Boyle, who I know has an interest in relation to this, because anybody who's ever been involved in agriculture realises the various stress and everything else can rise with animals, hypothermia in that situation. But can you outline what plans are going to be taken to avoid this serious situation that arose there in Greenfields in the last spring? And I know the weather was extreme, and I'm not a fool, and I appreciate that, but I would hope that this never happens again. There will be animal losses. That's going to happen, inevitable. That's an instance of farming or in any activity. But I would hope that this is a demonstration farm. It has to be held up to the highest standards and ideals. And I would hope that the outwintering facilities there take cognizance of the adverse climatic events and trends that are now prevalent in Ireland.
Thanks, Deputy. Deputy Cahill, please.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to welcome Professor Boyle here to the committee today. And, I think recognition has to be given for the work of Teagasc and the way they have, brought information and technology back to farmers, and I think, you know, their mandate has worked very well. I would welcome that they lift on the moratorium on recruitment, and I think, you know, that was long overdue, and with all respect to people, I think the age of advisors and the age of the you know, the management structure was increasing, and new blood into any organisation is absolutely vital. But I'd just like to ask the question as regards the salary levels that are available to Teagasc. Are you attracting the level of graduate that you want with the salary levels? Is there any restriction on the salary levels? Is there guidelines, and is that creating any difficulties? I just see a figure here for discussion groups that there's 12,000 farmers involved in discussion groups, and I presume 90 to 95% of those are probably dairy farmers. And I would like to see, you know, I think on the beef side, there is, I think, huge strides could be made if we get more beef farmers involved in discussion groups. And I know from personal experience, discussion groups and talking with your peers is probably the best way of the transfer of knowledge and the best way to see the practical advice coming from Teagasc implemented. And could you give us figures, Professor Boyle, about the exact number of students you have now full time in the ag colleges, and how much they have dropped in the last 2 to 3 years? On climate change, and you know, I noticed you're saying that, you know, and it's something I think that has been very noticeable, that Teagasc haven't been to the forefront of the climate change, and the climate change, I won't say debate, but the climate change challenge. And you know, there was a programme on RT1 last night, and about climate change and the bioeconomy, and the role that agriculture has to play in it. And funny, I think climate change, while it is a challenge to us, I actually think it is also an opportunity. And I think with the proper research and you know, we have the bioeconomy, with that bioeconomy research centre being positioned in the Sheen, and the waste coming from food processing, we have the biorefinery going in there next year. I think there's great opportunities for us in this whole sustainable food production, and I think it would be a shame if Teagasc having the budget there to come forward with serious research and advice, particularly at farm level. You know, as a committee, we were in UCD there early in the summer with Professor Kevin O'Connor, and like the research is proceeding at gallop speed, and the opportunities, in my view, are virtually endless. And I think, you know, we as farmers are definitely behind the curve of what European farmers are doing as regards climate change. And I think even the income opportunities that are there, and I was just talking to a continental farmer there lately, and he described income. He says his roof and with solar panels is an income for him. The cows itself is the second tier of his income, and the third tier is the slurry that's being produced. And definitely we've a long way to go to get onto that kind of a playing pitch. And I think there's something where I think a lot of resources have to be put into at farm level to show farmers the opportunities that's there. And you know, just as well as opportunities, you know, we have huge targets to meet on climate change, and I think definitely Teagasc, it is the one area where I feel we're definitely not up to speed. And you know, I think whatever amount of investment is needed by the government for Teagasc, I think they should be making a case for a specialised budget on climate change. Like 2020 is coming down the tracks very fast on us, and we haven't an earthly chance of meeting the targets that's going to be imposed on us by the EU. And in 2030 there's even more strenuous targets. So I think there's a huge amount of work there to be done, and I think Teagasc have a key role to play on that at farm level. I'm not going to put you on the spot on this, Professor Boyle, because I mentioned it to you outside, but the young farmers, and you know, the amount of farmers you know, that are going back farming full time, and we see, you know, we have a serious issue with our population, with the age of our farming population, and the average age of it doesn't read well, and attracting farmers, you know, young farmers back into the industry. I will always be a very strong advocate. The main way to get back into the industry is to have a viable income there. But leaving that aside, you know, we're just in the finance bill, and I know you weren't aware of it, but I don't want, but in the finance bill, and I think it's something I would like, and I wasn't here for AOB today, so I apologise for that, Chairman, I was late, but it's something I think we need to discuss, the finance bill and that ceiling that's been put into the finance bill as regards the amount of incentives young farmers can receive. And I would like, if we could get research onto what impact that will have on, how many young farmers exceed that ceiling. There's a 70,000 ceiling has been put into the finance bill there this year of what, stamp duty exemptions, stock relief exemptions that young farmers now qualify for. And, I suppose it's particularly on the dairy side where a young man comes back to dairy farm and he can have a lot of expansion and a lot of costs can take place, and both stock relief and stamp duty exemptions can be hugely influential in making these decisions economically viable. So I would just like to see where that 70,000 limit, what impact that would have. But getting young farmers back into, I would, and it's just something I think we might try to get more information from the department on it here as a committee as well. But those are just the main issues I'd like to raise with Professor Boyle.
Thanks, Deputy. Senator Mulhern, please.
Thanks, Chairman. Welcome, Professor Boyle. Just a few questions. You described some collaborations in the education field with ITs and in particular UCD. And I'm just wondering, is there a defined role for you in the development of technological universities, or to what extent have you been consulted? And is it more, would your participation potentially be more on an ad hoc basis depending on the particular alliance of colleges involved? In relation to your various education programmes, including the Green Cert, do you feel that issues pertaining to climate change, that there's more you could do in terms of education for farmers, young trained farmers, and the different, as regards the different courses you roll out? As has been mentioned, we were at UCD at the Beacon Bioeconomy Research Centre, which was really encouraging and exciting, and there is so much potential, and clearly technology will keep coming at us. But also another issue that regularly pops up here is the whole issue of the weak position of the farmer in the food supply chain. And we know that there's been a European-wide consultation on that and measures to be taken, particularly vis-à-vis the multiple retailers. But we don't have any solutions implemented yet. And I'm just wondering how, in relation to our farmers, do we help them achieve or earn added value to their products, as we have seen, in some cases in the case of UCD and the mushroom farmers they're working with, or the development of plastic as a byproduct from dairy. Like how are farmers really going to benefit from this, so as that they're not always crying because, and that's not a derogatory term, it's true, like at the moment we know the situation in relation to beef. How there can be some real change for farmers in relation to the price they receive for as primary producers, and also in the context of the bioeconomy, or do they have to form co-ops? Like, what's the means, and have you looked at this? And I suppose just finally, I've heard you on the radio talking about it, on the whole issue of climate change and our 2025 targets. And is it the reality that, like, as Deputy Cahill has outlined there, there's more we can do with the solar panels, maybe anaerobic digestion, but no matter what they do, it's not ring-fenced. Like, for example, if we got a farmer having a tractor that was working off a battery, for example, he's not assessed on the basis of his farm. That may very well, the benefit of that carbon reduction may go into transport. Like, are we in a situation really that as we increase the national herd, as we increase our food output, are we bound in terms of the obligations, because, like, I mean, we all talk about how carbon efficient we are, especially in dairy, and nobody says that we don't need to do more. But whatever we do, if we're ramping up production, there's going to be an increase, and if that's beyond what's envisaged for us in the 2020-2030 targets, do we need to renegotiate this? I mean, I think we should be upfront about it and be proud of achievements of farming, and considering how production has increased since the 1990s and carbon emissions have reduced, and there have been efforts made, but it's just to have a real conversation about it, because an awful lot of it is, I think people have become more aware of climate change, and now they want to be active and they want to do something, but instead of thinking they should do it themselves, they're looking at the farmers or agriculture, because it's a particular significant cohort of our greenhouse gas emissions in the country, but not looking at the fact we need to eat. Why shouldn't we be, all the positives, they're not being acknowledged within farming. So just a flavour of where do we go realistically with all of this.
Thanks, Senator. And finally, Deputy Corcoran Kennedy, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Mr. Boylan, for coming in here this afternoon, Professor Boylan. Just actually to follow on from the two previous speakers, I was just wondering what Teagasc are going to do in relation to the IPCC report, where we're being told that the climate is warming more rapidly than we had thought, and how the challenges that are facing agriculture are going to be dealt with in terms of our targets on Foodwise 2025. A number of us are on the Climate Action Committee also, and we're being told that forestry is something that we should be really doing an awful lot more with. And yet I know that a lot of farmers are kind of concerned around the tying up of a very arable and good quality land under forestry. And if you've looked at any models elsewhere that might be suitable, rather than having them tying up many, many acres, if you look at the number of farms across the country, if one farm was able to, say, plant an acre kind of thing, if that's something that you'd be looking at. And also, just in relation to the green certs, I'm very interested to see there that the adult distance education green cert has really increased. And is that something that you specifically, is it a particular course that you sold to do online, or what way is that actually being carried out? Because it's quite a figure, so it's over 1,000 people nationally.
Okay, Deputy. And finally, myself, Professor, I have two questions. One linked to the climate change issue. Has Teagasc done an analysis of the potential implication of us not reaching our 2030 targets in climate change? And the other question, Deputy or Professor O'Boyle, as you know, we've had in the last number of weeks the release of the new maps for the ANC areas. There are a number of areas around the country that were excluded on this occasion, that were included in the last occasion. What part can Teagasc play in an appeal process in assisting those who want to make an appeal, who feel, because it's all based on science obviously, and my understanding is that Teagasc, correct me if I'm wrong now, would have played a part in developing the maps, if we could put it that way, based on the evidence that you may have had, on the information you've had on the soil types over the past number of years. And what part can Teagasc play in assisting farmers in the future with their appeals going forward when the new appeals board is set up? So whenever you're ready, Professor Boyle.
Thank you, Chairman. Lots of questions there. Just one point that occurs to me straight away. I would like to invite the committee to visit Teagasc at some point in the future. There's reference made there to the Food Innovation Hub at Moore Park, which we have planning permission secured for. It'll probably still take 18 months or so before that's constructed. But that's all about adding value in the mainstream activities, dairy in particular. And we've also just won an Enterprise Ireland Regional Innovation Fund grant, along with Dairygold and Cork County Council, to build an agri-tech hub on our Kilworth farm to look at the whole area of precision agriculture. So there's a lot going on down in Moore Park. As far as climate change is concerned, and again, I would love to have you visit Johnstown Castle, because I was a bit disappointed in my own deputy from my own constituency there, referring to Teagasc not really having made a mark in climate change. And I would really have to strongly disagree with that assertion. It's probably the case that we haven't been jumping up on top of the rooftops about it, but as far as I'm concerned, the only coherent set of policy proposals that has been produced in relation to the agricultural transition, as it's called, to a neutral carbon future, was produced by Teagasc. We produced a very comprehensive document last June called the Marginal Abatement Cost Curve, where we have outlined no less than 27 specific measures, which we believe, if adopted, they're all based on science, if adopted, would substantially enable us to achieve our 2030 targets. The deputies are correct. We won't achieve our 20 targets in any sector, but agriculture is particularly challenged as we move forward because, and I would agree with Senator Mulhern, I think, and I've said this publicly, it's a perfectly legitimate aspiration for the agricultural sector and individual farmers to grow their businesses. At the same time, there are internationally binding obligations that we have signed up to. We have identified, notwithstanding scenario in our document, we've laid out different scenarios. In fact, we've considered 6 different scenarios for livestock numbers. And I'd be happy to make the document available to the members of the committee. In fact, it's going to be discussed tomorrow at the joint committee. We've laid out 6 scenarios in relation to livestock numbers because emissions in Irish agriculture follow livestock numbers. There's almost a direct correlation. And we've identified potential savings up to 2030 of 9 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent, which is very significant in the context of the benchmark being, the baseline being 20 megatons. As far as I'm concerned, we've been leading the way. The Department of Agriculture have endorsed our set of proposed measures. The new Minister for Climate Change has recently done the same. Now, the challenge is going to be, as I said, we've solved the problem on the spreadsheet. Yeah, no, fair enough. We've laid it out, and we're the only ones that have, because we have that expertise in-house. But the challenge is going to be, first of all, there's a shocking poor awareness among farmers, still, notwithstanding the year we've just had, about, first of all, climate change in general, but specifically about ammonia, which I've been harping on about for quite some time. I reckon the ammonia challenge is actually a bigger one and a more difficult one to get around. So there's an awareness issue that has to be addressed. There's a farm adoption issue in relation to, I'll just take 2 specific measures. For example, research has shown in Teagasc that if farmers were to switch from calcium ammonium nitrate as the source of nitrogen to a product called stabilised urea, you would achieve the same yield in terms of gas production, but you would reduce greenhouse gases and ammonia. But persuading farmers to make that link, at the moment there's no great difference in the cost of the fertilisers. We have shown as well, of course, for several years now, that the application of slurry by using threading shoe technologies, again, is a significant reduction in emissions. So the measures are there. The adoption is the issue, and it's not in our field, Chairman, but policy has to row in behind this then. And clearly, that's what we've been suggesting in the context of the next CAP, that the measures have to be consistent. So I would certainly be happy at a future date and again, if you couldn't visit Johnstown Castle, you get a full rundown on the research. We're spending huge resources in this area. I would say, though, for the future, I think we have to spend more, because the measures we've identified are based on current knowledge. It's a very rapidly changing field in relation to additives. In the last 3 weeks, for example, we have met companies that have developed 3 different products feed additives. And of course, they're all very optimistic at the beginning, and you have to analyse them and so forth. But this is a very rapidly changing field, and as I say, we're putting huge resources into it. But the challenge is going to be around adoption and the policy that will back up those measures. There was a mention made there of forestry, and look, I've described forestry previously for the agricultural sector as a kind of get-out-of-jail clause almost, because we estimate that 3 megatons, and remember this is huge, in other words, a third of the savings that we've identified would potentially come from forestry. The problem is the following. We've enough trees grown, thankfully, over the last 30 or 40 years to see us through probably to 2030. But if we don't up the rate of plantation, we'll hit a cliff in 2030. This year we estimate that plantations will be down, new plantations down to 4,500 hectares. The target is close to, I think, is around 8.5. They've fallen consistently over the last 2 years. So there's a real issue there. And there is massive opposition, as you all know, in some parts of the country. Again, I think what we have to get across to farmers, and particularly to dairy farmers, is that they should have an interest in trees. Because I think there's a big opportunity for native plantations, native woodlands plantations, and on every dairy farm in the country. Now, there is a significant percentage of the forest area, actually surprised me, on dairy farms. But I think there's more potential, and I think it would be a fantastic gesture on behalf of the dairy sector to demonstrate their willingness to address the issue around climate change. On the renewable side, again, we've identified the potential that's there for energy crops and so on. It's limited enough in the sense that there can be a displacement of fossil fuels. I've been a very strong advocate of anaerobic digestion, but the policy environment has to be right. We've built a demonstration plant in Grange, which is about to be commissioned to illustrate to farmers how you can use the grass-based biomass to produce high-quality gas. And we've also been discussing with a number of entities how that might be developed further. So there's an awful lot going on, but as I say, the policy follow-through is an issue. If I might come back to some of the specific points, Senator Daly raised the question of farm safety, and indeed at the Public Accounts Committee, if some colleagues were here, some members of your committee were at that meeting, the chairman did raise the whole issue of farm safety. Look, all of us, I think, have experienced, I'm sure, in our own lives, some tragedy on our farms, that we're all very aware of it. We work very closely with the Health and Safety Authority. Now, our remit is to deliver advice. They have a different remit to us, but they do work very closely with us. And we have a collaboration agreement with them. In terms of what we do quite a lot of research, because this is a really challenging area, because I think myself, there's a massive awareness of the issues, of the hazards. Most farmers have an awareness of the hazards. But yet, despite knowing the hazards, they still engage in practices that are clearly not safe. So we've done an awful lot of research around what is the behaviour that motivates this kind of attitude to health and safety. And we certainly have acquired an awful lot of insights that can inform our advisory activity. But the Deputy is 100% right. If you were to use the metric of farm fatalities and more generally farm injury, you certainly wouldn't be pointing to a positive trend. So it's something that we constantly try to work at. I mean, for example, the way we are appointing an additional specialist in farm health and safety. They work closely with our 260 advisors on the ground. That's the way we do it. We deliver the messages. Virtually at every farm discussion group, there's a health and safety topic. But I'd be the first to say that it's clearly not working. You know, sermonising and preaching is not enough. That's just a reality of it. Personally, and it's only a personal view, there has been a welcome improvement in the number of child fatalities, I'm happy to say. Personally, I think the farm business and the farmyard and the household have to be totally separate, in my opinion. It's a dangerous place for young people. Yet we see so many transgressions. Look, we're appointing a new specialist. As I say, we're trying to adapt the insights from research. I personally think that all of the entities involved could work more closely. I do believe that, particularly around promotional campaigns and all. We should all be involved in this together, and there's a number of entities, including the department, I think that we can all work more closely. I've talked about, Deputy Penrose raised and of course we are involved in promoting the code of practice, and we have training programs and all of that. But despite a massive effort, and there is a massive effort, and look, the challenge has been elusive so far. I wish I could come here today, Chairman, and suggest what's going to make a difference. Well, at the same time, we have been of the view for a long time that regulation or enforcement doesn't work, and it's very hard to put in place the kind of level of inspector that we need. I'm a strong believer in that. I don't believe it does work, but at the same time, we have to review what's going on. Deputy Penrose raised a number of very important issues that I'd like to address in relation to the Food Innovation Hub. Well, as I say, we hope to have that completed in about, we have planning permission in 18 months or so. I think it's going to be a very important development. We already have about 14 companies down in Moore Park, from all over the country, some from overseas who are doing business in Ireland. And they've come to us and said, look, we want a facility on site where we can have complete confidentiality, and at the same time we can use the shared resources that are available. And that's really the whole strategy behind that. And it's all about developing added value, not in the more exotic final consumer products but there's a massive amount of value added going on in food ingredients, and particularly in infant formula. I mean, it's a whole, we call it the smart ingredients sort of approach. It's probably not that all visible, but it's in terms of the ingredients which are demanded by the final producers of these products. That's where the innovation lies. Now, I want to address the issue of the Greenfield farm. We have sent
That's right, Jan. Thank you very much for your report. We received it.
No, and I did promise that a number of months ago, Deputy, when this issue was raised. And I want to address the very real issues that you raise. First of all, it's been a very strong view of mine that we have several demonstration farms around the country. And the whole point of a demonstration farm is that you learn as much, I think, from the bad outcomes as the good outcomes. And it was in that spirit that we commissioned a report now, along with the Greenfield farm. We said, look, we want to get the experts to look at this episode. We asked Tom Morden, former Secretary General, to chair that. We got an international expert on animal welfare under extreme conditions from the United States, with a number of other people, I think all eminent people. One man from our, one from our own board, a dairy farmer himself. And look, you did say, Deputy, and I think I quoted you right, it says, we can't bury the findings. I have no intention, or Teagasc has no intention of burying any findings here. I'd like to think that the report is a very candid account. It doesn't pull its punches in terms of the episode. I think it's a wake-up call for us, but it's also a wake-up call for farmers in the context of climate change. Now, I know my colleagues who know more about the science of these things than I would not say that you can't point to the year that's just passed as evidence of climate change. But for the layperson out there and the average farmer, I think it was. The episode was unprecedented, no doubt about that. Certainly none of the people working on the farm on a day-to-day basis had any experience of events like that ever occurring in their lifetime. That's just, and the one lesson for me is, and a very big lesson in relation to adaptation, which is the other side of climate change apart from mitigation, is that we have to have really robust training programs in place. And it's not just in agriculture. I think that, and I'm a member of the Climate Change Council, ex officio member. That's a point I've been making. Very obviously, we have to simulate these conditions, because it's, from what I read, and I think it comes across in the report, but from talking to the people involved, it was a frightening experience. Now, just to remind the committee of the structure, Teagasc is not a shareholder in this farm. We provide, I suppose, top-level managerial advice, and the farm manager reports to the so-called Moor Park officer on the ground. So clearly, we're not standing back from our responsibility in relation to what's identified in the report. And I see three things that have to be actioned. Number one is the governance structure. Lack clarity after the fact. When things were going well, and things were going very well, and an awful lot of young farmers up and down the country set up farms following the model, and probably wouldn't have been able to set up those farms otherwise. And after we called this report, I called for this report, I was asked to meet up to about 30 of them from all over the country. And I think there was one person over the age of 35. There were a fantastic bunch of people who were enabled to start up the business because of the blueprint and stuck at it. And then I'd say the difference between it and the Greenfield farm was, as they started making a surplus, they started investing in the facilities a bit more. So there was a dynamic component to what they were doing. And so I'd say from that perspective, you know, that aspect was a success. But Deputy, you're 100% right. Look, we're not going to hide anything here. There's a lessons around the governance, and that has to be clarified. And we have already actioned that. That's going to happen. There was an issue which is not excusable around the health and safety statements that needed to be put in place. And that's obviously happened after the fact. There was issues then which are going to be outside our control, but we'll be certainly advising the board of the farm to look at the facilities. And the particular facilities, I think, that were of most concern, are identified in the report, really were the facilities for the calving cows, actually. Now, I would have to say, again, the animal fatality, there were 2 cows and 4 calves that had died immediately due to the adverse effect, and 2 others that died shortly thereafter. But so we're saying 2 cows and 6 calves were the outcome. That's not acceptable. Obviously, no animal death is acceptable. But I think, in fairness, that has been put against the background of a fairly good health and safety record, animal health and mortality record on the farm, which is documented in the report. And again, the difference between this farm and what happened on an awful lot of private farms, that it is under the public gaze. And I think we've learned an awful lot from that. And I take up your point, Deputy, if there is not an improvement, I would expect to be back here and answer the questions that you've raised, the legitimate questions that you've raised. Okay.
Before you finish on that point, would you say at this stage that obviously this farm is based on the New Zealand model?
Yes.
Would you say at this stage that the New Zealand model is not fit for purpose in Ireland?
I don't think we could say that. I think, again, if you look at the report, I think a number of adjustments could be made to that system. Okay, they'll cost money, but it could be adapted. You know, I mean, that'd be my view. I mean, look.
The point I'm making is, the New Zealand model is we're running fast to stand still to a certain extent, getting bigger and bigger, more overheads. And you mentioned, you referenced there, this has been the system adopted by a number of the younger farmers, obviously. It's great to have younger farmers getting involved in farming, and this is one of the big issues that we have. I think it might have been referenced there earlier on. I know of a particular farm not too far away from myself at home, who will have a similar type model, and same kind of issues would arose during that particular difficult time. And the same issue with the consequence, there was a deficit in feeding, animal welfare difficulties with regard to weather and so on and so forth, you know. Now, it's a cheaper model it's supposed to get into, but the consequences of...
I suppose you have to ask what is the New Zealand model, and one of the characteristics of the New Zealand model is, of course, scale. And look, I have my own views on that. I think we can drive scale so far in this country, but you run into obstacles, as this farm did in relation to labour, for example, very quickly. I don't think we're ever going to replicate the scale that exists in New Zealand. Obviously, the weather is a different. Well, it depends if you're on the north or the South Island. The South Island is closer to us here. As I say, if you take those young people, I think the difference is, and this is something we've learned. Like we set out, or the project was set out, laid out the business plan, and there wasn't really a dynamic element in it. Actually, in fairness, in terms of when you would pause and say, look, we need to maybe make some new investment and so on. I think in the typical farm situation, that's exactly what happens. You know, you're starting out, everyone, young person is short of cash. They're going to take risks because they have to. They don't have the cash, they can't borrow enough. They try to build up, and when they do get a surplus, then they say, right, it's time to, you know, put in place creature comforts for the farmer himself and for the animals. And that's the way it typically evolves. And I'd say this farmer's got to that point where there's a pause button now pressed, and there will have to be investments as a consequence of what happened. And that's going to be, hopefully, that'll be picked up by farmers out there. So I think we've learned an awful lot. Just, Deputy Cahill raised a few issues about the moratorium. I have to agree with him, of course, we're delighted that's lifted. But I've made no bones about the fact that the salary levels for starting researchers and advisors and so on in the organisation is a major problem and becoming more so every day. Now, I would have to acknowledge we're no different to the rest of the public sector, and we're not going to be top of the queue for any adjustment in the near future, unlike, you know, other sectors that are out there that would be more well known. But the starting salary for someone, for example, who has completed a PhD, takes 4 years to do a PhD, maybe sometimes 5, but we tried to complete them in 4 years, is 32,500. That's the starting salary, and it's simply not competitive. And not alone is it not competitive with the private sector, which we wouldn't expect it to be, but it's not competitive either with the university sector, which is our main problem, because that's where we're competing. So it is an issue, and we do have to go down the line sometimes to less qualified candidates. Sometimes people take up the position, they stay a short while and they're gone. Sometimes we've had to go through several interviews to get people. It is an issue. I can't see a quick solution to it, because it's bound up with the whole national public finances. And look, I have an economics background and I can understand the wider macroeconomic issues, but we seriously have concerns. On discussion groups, look, discussion groups have worked in dairy, there's no doubt about it. They have been less successful in beef, but with the knowledge transfer scheme, beef farmers have come into the system. We'd be confident enough that when the scheme ends next year, that a number of them will stay on. Because the message we're trying to get across to them is, look, the concession you got farmers received for joining the knowledge transfer scheme really pales into insignificance with the benefits in terms of profitability and incomes. I don't have the detailed figures, Deputy, but I'll supply them to the committee in relation to the student enrolments. Except to say in general terms, the last few years we have had a levelling off in college attendance, and in fact it's dropped back a little bit. Now, it's not uniform across the country. For example, Ballyhaise, for some reason, has maintained numbers, has bucked the trend a little bit. But the college enrolments have been more than offset by the part-timers. And someone talked about the distance education. people. Really, there are huge incentives by way of grant aid and so forth, and there was access to the National Reserve, quota reserve there for a period for people that are about to inherit farms, but they have to get a qualification, and that's why there was a big influx of people that, with other qualifications such as accountants and so forth, solicitors. There was quite an array of people that were eligible for the distance programme, and that's why they came in. But equally, we've had a huge increase in numbers coming through from people with farming backgrounds. Now they wouldn't have prior qualifications, so they have to do the what we call the part-time routes at the regional centres. One point I would make, though, is we've about 2,000 people at the moment on a waiting list in the north and northeast, and we're hoping to be able to work down through that demand, but it is very difficult with the limited resources that we have. Anyway, I've talked to the Deputy and I'll talk to him again at some stage about our work on climate change, because I think, as I said, I think it's been front and centre in terms of the national response. And I will follow up on the point about stamp duty. I wasn't aware of that.
I'm trying to change. I don't think there's a farm level. We're not adapting at farm level, like solar panels, digesters. There's been no innovation at farm level yet.
No, I wouldn't disagree with that.
That was where I was.
Yeah. Okay.
Because I was at the briefing that you gave them all in Boswell's.
Yeah.
You have. I'm not saying you haven't got the facts at you, but it hasn't. No.
Yeah, no, that's the challenge, and I think, as I said, it's a combination of intensive advisory activity, but I don't think it's going to need, in my opinion, although it's not my area to say so, but it's going to need a policy support coming behind that. Like, for example, on the solar panels, one thing that we're going to be doing in Teagasc is that every Teagasc dairy farm in the first instance will have PV panels, hopefully by the end of next year, and all of our colleges. Because I think that's a no-brainer as far as I'm concerned. It's a win-win, and we're hoping to work with the Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland. Senator Mulhern asked about the technological universities. Obviously, we have partnerships with virtually all of the IoTs and with UCD and with UCC at the higher level. We're not directly involved in any of the discussions around the establishment of the universities, of the new universities, except insofar as a lot of the universities will want Teagasc to support their research activity. So, for example, I mentioned the Walsh Fellowship Programme. We have 250 PhD students. A number of those would be with institutes of technology, and we would expect with the technological universities those numbers will increase. So our partnership is more at that end, and we will continue. We have very strong partnership, for example, with Dundalk IT and with Waterford IT, Cork IT, and a number of others. Pardon? And GMIT, sorry, of course, yes. We have, yes, oh yeah.
Is that Galway campus or at Mount Bellew?
At Mount Bellew.
At Mount Bellew.
Yeah. Oh, we have long-standing relationship with GMIT, yes. In relation to, you asked a very good question about climate change on the curriculum, education curriculum. We have completed last June, I think, we published what we call our education vision blueprint, which is a programme really to take us up to 2050. Believe it or not, the Green Cert is about 30 years old. So 30 years in educational terms is very little, is very short. Obviously, the curriculum is constantly improving. Personally, I would like if at the moment we don't have autonomy in regards to the design of the curriculum. We have to defer to Quality Qualifications Ireland. They're the actual supervisory body. We do hope to get autonomy. When we do that, we'll be able to respond far more quickly to changing needs. And certainly at the moment, obviously, sustainability broadly is more broadly, including climate change, is part of the curriculum. But you're absolutely right. It's going to increase hugely into the future. You raised a question about, it's a hardy chestnut, about the farmer in the food supply chain, and unfortunately, in terms of really, Irish farmers have very little control over prices because of the nature of the market. I mean, they're price takers effectively. In some niche markets, they probably have a little bit more influence than in others, but certainly in the broader commodities, they don't. They can influence themselves the quality of the product, of course, which makes a massive difference to the price they get. Our approach, Senator, is to focus on research as a driver of value added, which hopefully will translate into benefits for the farmer, but certainly will translate into greater efficiencies on farm, which will give the farmer a little bit more headroom. The issue now that's very evident to me in the food sector is, particularly for commodity production, is that increasingly issues of quality, issues of food provenance, issues of the sustainability of production are becoming a requirement almost to be in the marketplace. It's not that the farmer is going to get a premium for producing his product in this way, but it's a requirement to be in the marketplace. And that's a reality that I think is becoming very evident. Right. Deputy Kennedy, yes, well, again, you raised the question about the IPCC report, and I think hopefully it was a wake-up call for us all. And as I say, we have identified, which I think are, if they were implemented, would allow us to kind of square the circle between growth in dairy production and the need to adhere to very stringent targets. The potential, obviously, of not meeting the targets, Chairman, is presumably significant fines, to say the least, and we're probably going to. I'm not sure what's going to happen in 2020, but even if it's a small level of fine that has to be paid, I think the visibility of that will create massive difficulties, and a continuation of breaches of our growth in emissions really will point to an inability or an unwillingness on the part of the country to address the challenges. So what you'd always be worried about is that while the whistle hasn't blown yet, you know, it may blow in the not too distant future if we continue the way we're going, and none of us know how that can work out. Now, you asked me a very hard question finally about our role in relation to appeals. This is always a very difficult. We were, as you say, involved in a research exercise initially. In fact, I recollect when the original maps came out first, Ireland was going to be a substantial net loser, the way in which the maps were constructed, for the simple reason, if I recall what my colleagues told me at the time, the officials in Europe that put this map together had forgotten that we're a very wet country. So we rebalanced things, I think, at the time, and I'm more comfortable in us engaged in that high-level role than engaged in an individual case-by-case submission. Obviously, any farmer who wants to make an appeal can draw on the research we have, which is publicly available.
I suppose the question I'm asking really is, say, for example, Townland X. Have you information on Townlands as regards to soil type?
Oh, we do, yeah.
That may be of assistance to farmer Y to make his appeal.
Yes, and we have information now on. We do have, because we've completed eventually. We completed the full soil map of Ireland, which is now available. Obviously, we'd like it to be available in more detail, but certainly it's a resource. We also now have. We're building up huge local information on, say, for livestock systems on grass production, you know, in very localised data on that. So that information is all publicly available.
Sorry to put across you. The question I'm asking again now, following on from that, is Farmer Y who wants to make an appeal and is not a client of yours. Will there be a cost involved in him accessing that information?
No, that information is all publicly available.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, as I said earlier, I mean, we have a remit to serve all farmers. Only some of the farmers, whatever it is, a third of them or so, are actually paying clients. And so we discharge that responsibility primarily through publications and information on the web and so on. That's all there for any farmer.
Okay, I think there's two further questions. Deputy Kenny was there coming in, and Senator Lombard has a follow-up brief question as well.
Apologies that I was missing for the earlier part of the meeting, another event. First of all, thank you very much for your contribution. And really the issue I just wanted to get a little bit of a steer on. Teagasc does an awful lot of work and research, and does a lot of work and research into various, I suppose, different land uses and what potential there may be there. And I'm interested in the further development of that research, because research and development is something we hear as a kind of a buzzword everywhere, R&D, and I'm conscious that an awful lot of the time, a lot of the research that's done can prove a concept, can prove its economic viability at a certain scale, but commercialising that and making it a reality requires somebody to take it on, and usually that's left to the private sector to do that. And while farmers may have an interest in something, and I suppose that the example would be the like of the work that was done around willow and around various other miscanthus and different grasses and all of that. Really what you're talking about there is not just developing an alternative or an additional farm enterprise, you're talking about developing a sector, because there's no point in growing this stuff unless it's going to be processed someplace, unless it's going to be brought to market someplace, and unless there's a clear, if you like, track that this can go down where people can believe in it and believe that there's going to be a future in it. And I'm just wondering, in respect of that, is there a missing, is there a gap there? And how could that gap be filled? If there is a gap, which I absolutely understand, if it's not Teagasc's place to bring that to the conclusion, but how or where do you think that could be brought to a conclusion, where we could develop some of these, what are at the moment, if you like, ideas really, that have been trialled and found that could work? How can we get them to develop into sectors that will be viable and will be an alternative for farmers in many areas?
Senator Lombard, final brief question.
Very brief, Chair. Look, I'd be very brief, and apologies, Professor, that I missed most of your presentation. I was actually had to go in and vote. Just two minor issues. Well, not minor really. Could I ask you to comment on the financial trends that you produced here today? Pensions seem to be a very large part of that. Pensions seem to be around 43 million euros. Going forward, your projections, where do you see that figure going, and where do you see that figure being a percentage of your actual expenditure itself? Do you, like many other organisations, feel that pensions will become a burden on you? Do you think it could affect in many ways your capacity to grow your service or to be proactive in the space itself? And obviously it's an issue for the state, an issue for society, but where do you feel that pension issue is going to come into play? And the other issue, Chair, and I'll be very brief, you gave a presentation or an answer to the Greenfield scenario of what happened during the several weather events. In media reports, one of the issues that was mentioned was that there was 3 Teagasc personnel, members of the Phelan family, and I think a Farmers Journal staff member might have turned up to help on that occasion, which was a very significant labour issue. Where do you think labour of 370 cows having 2 members of staff fits into the model of farming when you do have a crisis scenario? There's very few farmers in the country could call on such expertise of that labour if you are in that crisis scenario. And the depth and the lack of labour is a huge issue for us as an agricultural community. Where do you think that falls into what happened at Greenfields and the actual recommendations about changes to housing and other issues will go forward? Thank you, Chair.
To conclude, Professor.
Deputy Kenny's points, first of all. No, I think you raised a really interesting question about, I suppose you're saying really some research, I guess, first of all, unless it's used, is useless. I mean, that's the perspective I have, and we do research both in agriculture and in food. And the biggest challenge we have is not so much doing the research, is in getting the research adopted, or doing the type of research that people will adopt. And I've often talked about two contrasting situations where, on the one hand, there was very successful adoption, and I would say it would be the work we have done along with ICBF on the Economic Breeding Index for dairy. I would consider that to be one of the most successful pieces of research that was done in the history of agriculture, actually, in Ireland. Because at the beginning of that work, going back nearly 20 years, we had a huge problem of fertility with our dairy herd. That's nearly resolved now. Since then, we've also introduced genomic selection. We're the second country in the world to do it. I've asked my colleagues there about a year ago to put some economic numbers on this, and I think conservatively they reckon the cost-benefit ratio, or the benefit-cost ratio, is about 20 to 1. Because the EBI has been going up year on year. The EBI is a simple index of the profitability of dairy production, and it's gone up by about a rate of €10 a year. And what's interesting about that in many respects is that the research is quite complex. As my colleague often says, the head of research in Teagasc, Frank Amari, says when you look under the bonnet it's quite complicated, and you close the bonnet fairly quickly. But the actual implementation is very simple. The farmers to go out and buy, we say to them, look, buy a combination of straws, spread your risk, and look at the traits you're interested in and so forth. And you know, depending on your liquid milk or your manufacturing milk. And it's very simple. And then the advisory service come in behind it. And so, on the other hand, I would have to say I'd be quite disappointed, although I'm forever an optimist as to the uptake of some of the grassland work we've done. It's been a massive challenge to get farmers to adopt what are, at the end of the day, fairly straightforward technologies. Now, we're working on that. We've put a lot of investment in, both at a research and advisory level. But it's interesting, the contrast between the two. The science is probably fair to say not as involved on the grassland side as it is on the breeding side. And yet the uptake hasn't been as good as we would have liked. And I think we have to look there at how we can devise systems. I think this is where you're coming at. It's a whole system approach when you're using grassland optimally. Like, you have to be linked in terms of your fertilizer, your grass seed company. You have to be capable of measuring the grass, recording the information. So there's a lot of elements to it. And there may be critical elements that in the system that don't work well. And one of the ones we're looking at the minute is the whole measurement side. And whether we could encourage, for example, companies or single-person operations around the country even to actually provide a service, create a whole new market, provide a service in grass measurement to a farmer to enable that information to be uploaded then onto pasture base, to bring in the advisory service then at that point when the information is available. Because I think that's where the future is going. Advice in the future is going to be data-driven, data-led, or data-based maybe is more accurate. The advisor won't have to visit the farmer anymore. If the farmer has the information on the mobile phone, the advisor could be anywhere in the world and can say to the farmer, look, let's look at your grass wedge on your mobile phone and we'll talk about it. But I think you've, the way as I think of what you're saying is that increasingly we're going to have to think about the development of new systems of production. And I'll give you an example, one of the best examples, and going back a long time. If you look at the mushroom industry in Ireland, and I know it's a lot of trouble with Brexit and everything else, and it's changed utterly, but that industry was established absolutely out of research. It didn't exist before a whole concerted program of research was put in place to create a whole industry. And I think in many respects, that's where we're at the minute. I mean, for example, I think an area which is going to require that kind of system-wide thinking is around the development into the future of the beef system. I mean, in the past there was a far greater degree of integration between dairy and beef than there is now. And that's because the quota intervened and it created, a whole new massive growth in the beef cow. We're going back to a point now where we're going to have to say, how can we achieve greater integration? And that's going to be a challenge, because it's not going to happen through the marketplace, because all of the pressures are for the opposite. But I think there's huge opportunity, because, for example, in the whole growth of contract rearing of heifers and so on, that creates an opportunity for a good beef stockman. At the same time, there is a responsibility on all of us involved with the dairy sector to make sure that the quality of calf that is produced can lead to a decent quality and valuable beef animal. And that's where there's going to have to be, as I say, the market won't deliver that. There has to be some way of developing that system. Look, I'll give other examples. I certainly saw in some countries now very successful agroforestry developments, which is a whole new system. In the energy area, you'll find that as well. That there's the biggest problem we have in a lot of the development of energy is that there's no market. The farmer, learns how to produce, use biomass and to produce energy, and then finds the market either doesn't exist or it's highly volatile and goes out of business. I think, I'm not sure what the answer is, but you certainly have identified, I think, a very important issue. How can we create the kind of robust agricultural systems into the future? There's both opportunities and challenges. Senator Lombard, just in relation to pensions, well, I'd just say, look, we're a bit unusual in that the pension comes out of our grant and aid. If you were in a government department, for example, you wouldn't worry about that because it's out of central fund, or I think in a lot of other public bodies, that's the way it operates. Our pension it's a pay-as-you-go system. It operates on the same basis as the rest of the public sector. Insofar as there is a concern around pensions, it's a wider concern than just joggers. Obviously, each year we negotiate with our parent department on our grant and aid for the following year. So we have very clear, it's not too difficult to forecast retirements and so on, but so far the facts have been responded to appropriately. I think there's a bigger issue around public sector pensions that I'm sure all the deputies are well aware here. In a different life, I certainly had some interest in that. On the Greenfield, you identified that there was a significant response on the day of the storm from a number of my own colleagues, and the feelings you mentioned and so forth. I'd like to think that in most parts of Ireland, in a crisis situation, people would club together. I mean, that's the nature of things. The conditions were atrocious, and that's one of the issues that's picked up in the report. Actually, people did go genuinely. I know it's a phrase that sometimes is misused, but they did go above and beyond the call of duty, in my opinion, on the day in question. But you raise a bigger issue, though. I mean, in regards to the labour situation and the number of cows. There is an acute labour situation on dairy farms. For some reason this year, we certainly didn't get as many issues coming up from the farms as we did last year, actually, oddly enough. We took an initiative last year on foot with the Minister requesting us to set up a group to examine the whole issue in regards to the sourcing of labour, both within the country and outside of the country, One of the biggest problems you have on dairy farms is, in our opinion, and there's a fundamental flaw in the model, you can't have untrained people working on dairy farms, just can't. And the challenge is, how do you recover the cost of the training? We are prepared in Teagasc, we have subvented that in a small scheme last year, where people that were on unemployment assistance, for example, we trained them up in a couple of colleges and so forth. But it cost us, and we weren't able to recover it subsequently. It's very little. It's disappointing. We had looked at overseas as well. Now, we did get a change on foot of our work on that committee. We got a change in the migrant worker permits. But again, the take-up is very poor so far. Look, it's a slow burner. I mean, our view is that, certainly on research, the problem is once you go above 120 cows, you have a labour situation in most cases, and even at 120 cows, if you factor in reasonable allowance for days off and so on, you will need some casual labour support. That's the difficulty. There is a great opportunity. I mean, we've done all the work to someone. There's probably a couple of thousand jobs over the next 4 or 5 years, potentially. There's also the issue of salary. I mean, we're producing about, graduating now on Friday, we'll have about, I think it's 20-25 new managers coming forward. Now, they're going to expect to get significantly above the minimum wage. And it's not every farm can afford that kind of wages. So I don't know. I don't have an answer for you. You know.
Okay, Professor O'Boyle, members, and that completes our presentation for today. Thank you very much for your appearance here today, and likewise I thank you for your invitation to Moore Park. It is part of our work schedule and the good news is we intend visiting early in the new year. Towards the end of January we have provisionally scheduled in. Obviously we'll be working on that as we progress, but we're looking forward to that. I think it will be an important part of our committee to see the actual work that's going on. Like we visited UCD there before the summer, and we saw the work that's being developed there as well in the Beacon arrangement. It's very beneficial as well for our committee to see exactly what's happening. So we're looking forward to that in the new year. And again, to thank you for coming before our committee today. As there's no further business, the meeting is adjourned until next Tuesday at 3:30.